Welcome to this last session of the conference. The first speaker is Andrea Bottani from the University of Bergamo, and the title of his talk is How to Get Numbers Out of Quantities and Not the Other Way Around. At the beginning of the conference, we mentioned the fact that some persons have been especially important in the history of this series of conferences. Andrea Bottani has been the organizers of one of them, has been involved, I think, in all of them, and is one of the main characters of this study.
It's too kind of you, George. Anyway, let me begin with some examples. How old is Maria? Maria is 31 years old. How much did he drink? He drank 3 glasses of wine. What's the charge of one proton? The charge of one proton is 1.6 by 10 to the power of minus 19 coulombs, etc. Quantitative attributes involve numbers in a way in which other kinds of attributes do not. This is a plain fact. But there is the problem to explain why. The plain reason, some have suggested, is that quantities are grounded in simple relations to numbers. My notebook has 1.6 kilos mass because it bears the relation mass in kilos to number 1.6. There are a number of versions of this idea. For example, one is Mundy, 1988, another one, Weatherson, 2006, etc. It is in this that, according to some, the difference between quantitative and non-quantitative attributes consists. This naive idea has various drawbacks. First, my notebook bears the relation mass in kilos to the number 1.6, just in case it bears the relation mass in grams to the number 1,600, just in case it bears the relation mass in pounds to the number 3.5274, etc., etc., etc. In short, there is no number such that, for some unit of measure m, my notebook fails to bear the relation mass in m to that number. One may ask why on earth this should be seen as a problem. Well, masses are fundamental. If they hold in virtue of some relation, that relation cannot be less fundamental. So the problem with the naive idea is that it introduces infinite fundamental relations to explain the very same fact, that a particular object whatsoever has the mass it has. Second problem, the existence of numbers seems less certain, might seem less certain than the existence of quantities like mass or charge or size. So the naive idea seems to explain the more certain on the basis of the more uncertain. Third, if numbers exist, it is far from clear what they are, and even less clear what it is to bear a Q in U relation to a number where Q is a quantity, for example, mass, and U is some unit of measure, for example, grams. Suppose, for example, numbers are what Frege thought that they are, that is, sets of sets. In what consists having the relation mass in grams with a set of sets? And what grounds my notebook bearing that relation to the set? The worry is that the naive idea ends by explaining the clearer by means of the less clear. Are these knockdown arguments? Probably not. But I think they are enough to consider to invert the order of fundamentality and treat numbers as derived and quantities as fundamental. The idea is not new. In a number of works, especially in 1999, Joel Mitchell, among others, defended the idea that magnitudes and their relations are in the world, and numbers can be defined in terms of them. The world contains, I quote, continuous quantities which sustain numerical relations of the appropriate kind between magnitudes. So, the appropriate kind of numerical relation is this. If A and B are magnitudes of the same quantity, then the ratio of I to B equals R, where R is a real number. So in a nutshell, numbers are dependent on quantities since they can be defined in terms of ratios of magnitudes. Since ratios are currently seen as ordered pairs of numbers, for example, 3/2, where the second does not equal 0, one can wonder whether ratios of magnitudes do not depend themselves on numbers, rather than the contrary. But ratios can indeed be defined without the use of numbers. In the antiquity, the ratio of two magnitudes was not conceived of as a numerical value, but as a primitive relation. This conception is clear from Eudoxus of Cnidos' definition of proportion, which is the subject of the 5th book of Euclid's Elements. Here is Eudoxus' definitions in Euclid's words. Quantities are said to be in the same ratio, the first to the second and the third to the fourth, when, if any equimultiples whatever are taken of the first and third, and any equimultiples whatever of the second and fourth, the former equimultiples alike exceed or alike equal to or alike fall short of the latter equimultiples respectively taken in corresponding order. Let quantities which have the same ratio be called proportional. I'm not interested in analyzing precisely the meaning of this definition, just to note that since the definition employs the idea of a multiple, it might be disputed that it really does without numbers. What Eudoxus and Euclid seem to say in more explicit way is this. This is a paraphrase of the preceding definition. And this paraphrase quantifies on numbers, for all numbers n and k. This is a criterion of identity for ratios, similar in structure to Frege's well-known two-level identity criterion for directions, which explains the identity of ratios in terms, among others, of numbers. Perhaps, however, multiples do not necessarily require numbers. In geometry, they can be clarified instead in terms of congruence and overlap. In particular, a segment X can be said to be 3 times as long as a segment Y, just in case there are segments Z, W, J, such that each of them is congruent with Y, none of them overlaps any of the others, nothing overlaps X that does not overlap either Z or W or J, nothing overlaps either Z or W or J that does not overlap X. So more shortly, X equals the sum of Z, W, or J. This is also the case when the ratios of two segments does not correspond to a rational number. Here is an example concerning pi Greek, which is the length ratio of the circumference to its diameter. Segment X is 3 blah 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 as long as a segment Y, just in case there are segments Z, W, J, such that, and here there are a lot of clauses which correspond just to the 3 first digits of pi Greek. And you can imagine how long it should be. But anyway, one can go on stating congruence clauses as long as one likes, just as one can go on writing digits as long as one likes. Okay. Now, suppose that each fundamental quantity, say mass, charge, size, etc., is not only representable as, but also is a metric space. That way, every fundamental quantity can be most naturally conceived of as a continuous ray, having zero as an external limit and expanding with no limit in the opposite direction, where all mass magnitudes are points of one ray, ordered by a peculiar ordering relation. All charge magnitudes are points of another ray, ordered by another peculiar ordering relation, etc. And suppose that the magnitudes of each single quantity are closed under the fundamental algebraic operations. I'm not interested here either in giving arguments to prove that mass, charge, temperature, etc. are indeed spaces of this kind, or in clarifying in any way the nature, ontological status, and fundamentality of such topological structures. For example, are they be treated as a set of isolated spaces, as Wolf 2020 suggests, or rather as fundamental dimensions of unitary quality space, as Colling 2013 suggests? Are they better conceived of in a substantivalist way, as independent from anything locating in them, as Arnsenius and Dor 2012 maintain, or rather in a relationalist way, that is, as a system of distances between entities located in them, either Platonic universals, as in Mundi 1987, or particular objects, as in Sappes 1951. I'm inclined to treat fundamental quantities as dimensions of a unitary quality space, conceived of in a relationalist way as a system of quality distances between particulars, just as physical space is, according to Leibniz, a system of physical distances between bodies. But I remain completely silent about all this now. My aim here is just to show how numbers can be defined in terms of quantities, provided that quantities are spaces of this kind. Under the assumption that fundamental quantities are linear spaces of this kind, multiples of magnitudes, and thus ratios of them, can be defined without employing numbers in the way showed above for line segments. If fundamental quantities are rays, magnitudes are points on these rays. For each point P on a ray, there is exactly one segment, the segment having P and 0 as its limits. The ratio of two magnitudes of the same quantity, for example, two superdeterminate masses, Mk and Mi, is the ratio of the corresponding segments, that is Mk0 and Mi0. This ratio is not a number, but a structure completely describable in geometric terms of overlap and congruence. For any real number, there is one just such structure, and vice versa. I assume that this geometric characterization of magnitudes grounds the numerical one. If so, numerical magnitudes should be construed as purely geometrical magnitudes, and numbers are no longer required to compare magnitudes of the same quantity to each other. Magnitudes are currently referred to by choosing a unity of measure and specifying their ratios to the unit in numbers. The mass of my PC, for example, is 1.6 times 1 kilo. If numbers are not necessary to specify ratios to the unit of measure, they are unnecessary to measurement. Numbers are ordinarily conceived of as measuring quantities, but now we see that quantities can be measured without using numbers. This seems to tell us something important about numbers, yet it is far from clear exactly what. Perhaps the moral to be drawn is that numbers are dispensable. To tell it in Field's words, very famous words, mathematics is conservative. Any inference from nominalistic premises to a nominalistic conclusion that can be made with the help of mathematics could be made usually more long-windedly without it. This is science without numbers. If so, mathematical entities do not exist except as mere tools to speed up and make easier our inferences about magnitudes. But the moral to be drawn might be different after all, maybe anti-Philian. The moral might be that numerical magnitudes are ultimately geometric in nature, and numerical facts are geometric facts after all. A pebble being 3 grams, for example, might ultimately consist in the fact that the point where the pebble is located on the line of mass has a certain position in a peculiar kind of geometric structure that involves another point called 1 gram and their relative distance. Please tell me when I have still 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay, thank you. Okay, since magnitudes can be geometrically related in the required way only if they are points of the same ray, that is, magnitudes of the same quantity, ratios are intra-ray relations. But proportions, that is, equivalences of ratios, are largely inter-ray relations. In other terms, there is nothing as the ratio of a mass magnitude to a charge magnitude, but the ratio of 2 mass magnitudes can be the same as the ratio of 2 charge magnitudes. So here is a proposal to define numbers in geometric terms. Numbers are properties of points on the same ray. This is couples of magnitudes of the same quantities. A couple of points, Pn and Pk on the ray of mass, have number 2, for example, just in case one of the segments Pn0 and Pk0 is the sum of non-overlapping segments Z and W, and the other one is congruent with both Z and W. Clearly, a great and an infinite number of couples of mass magnitude have number 2. The same is true of charge magnitudes, temperature magnitudes, and so on and so forth. What I've just said for number 2 can be repeated mutatis mutandis for all positive real numbers. Having a number is thus for a couple of magnitudes satisfying a condition entirely given in geometric terms of overlap and congruence. There is a problem with this geometric characterization of number, however, that has to do with the question of a non-symmetric converse relations. If having number 2 is a property had by couples of points, magnitudes having number, is a property had by couples of points or magnitudes having number 1/2, must be a property had by all and only those couples of segments that have number 2. Well, but it's not in the same order. One might say that the couple has the 2 numbers. Ordered one way, it has number 2, ordered another way, it has number 1/2. This misses the point, however, for the fact that Pn has number 2 relative to Pk just is the fact that Pk has number 1/2 relative to Pn. These are just one fact, not 2 different facts. Take my piece's mass being twice as your piece's mass. This fact is the very same fact as your piece's mass being 1/2 of my piece's mass. But if there is only one fact in play here, then this fact can only arise from the holding of one relation. And if there is one relation, just one relation, then there is just one number. And 1/2 cannot be different from 2. But it is. Since numbers cannot be treated as asymmetrical relations between points, I suggest to treat them as monadic properties of segments. Let me introduce some stipulations. If a segment PQ is such that P lies on Q0, but Q does not lie on P0, in other words, P is between 0 and Q, I say that 0P is the bridge to 0 of PQ, and PQ is an island of 0P. In general, a segment is the bridge to 0 of an island just in case it touches point 0, and is an island of a bridge just in case it does not touch point 0. A segment is a bridge if and only if there is an island of which it is a bridge. And it is an island if and only if there is a bridge of which it is an island. Since every segment either touches or fails to touch point 0, but never both, every segment is either a bridge or an island, but never both. This said, it is easy to see that different islands can have the same bridge, but no island can have different bridges. Every island, this is the idea, has a number relative to its bridge, this number being the length ratio of the island to its bridge, where this ratio is characterized in terms of overlap and congruence. The relativity can be given up, however, since any segment that has a bridge has just one bridge and suffices by itself to determine its bridge. The number had by a segment relative to its bridge is thus its number simpliciter. Number 1, for example, is the property of being congruent with its own bridge. Figuratively, the number of an island is the degree to which the island extends toward 0 relative to the distance that still remains to reach 0. Or equivalently, the degree to which an island extends away from 0 relative to the distance that has already been covered starting from 0. I've said that islands have numbers, but and I said that what numbers they have. But what about the segments that touch point 0 and so are not islands but bridges? Just as the number of an island is its length ratio to its bridge, the number of a bridge is its length ratio to its bridge, where the only bridge that the bridge can select as its bridge is itself. A bridge, so to say, connects to point 0 by its own hands. Since a bridge selects itself as its own bridge, for any point P, the number of the segment P0 is the ratio of P0 to itself. Given that, this ratio is invariably 1 to 1. All segments that are bridges have number 1. In other words, a bridge and all the segments of which it is a bridge have a number relative to the same segment, that is the bridge itself. That way, every segment on every ray comes to have 1 and no more than 1 number. But the ratio of the numbers had by different segments is not always proportional to the ratio of their lengths, even less coincides with it. Segments that are congruent with each other have different numbers whenever they have different bridges. And segments having the same number fail to be congruent with each other whenever they have different bridges. Similarly, a segment S2, S1 can be much more shorter than a segment S2, while having a greater number, provided the bridge of S1 is by far shorter than the bridge of S2. As an example, see the figure below, where segment PQ has number 2, because it's 2 times its bridge, 0P. The segment RS has number 1, because it's 1 time its bridge, the segment 0R. And RS is much longer than PQ. Okay? How much should us be worried about that? Not very much, I believe, for some reasons. First, this is not surprising. This is not a surprising fact, for the number of a segment has nothing to do with its absolute length, whatever an absolute length might be. It has to do with how long the route from P to Q is relative to the route from Q to 0. The case in which PQ is itself a bridge, and so has no bridge or has as its bridge itself, can be thought of as a case in which PQ and 0Q come to coincide. Second, one important thing is that each segment of a ray yields, depending on its number, an assignment of numbers to any other points of the same array. The number assignments yielded by different segments of the same array to its points are always different. But the important thing is that all these assignments converge in determining the same ratios of magnitudes on their own array. And third, it is possible to analyze the basic algebraic operations on numbers, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, in terms of geometric operations on segments. I'll show very soon how this can be done. Just a limited point about, limited note about what numbers are. Because I've said something about the attribution of numbers, something about the condition of the attribution, something about the entities to which the attribution is made, but I've said nothing about numbers themselves yet. That is, nothing about what they are, if they exist at all. Let me say something about this now. Treated in the described way, numbers are properties of quality regions. These regions being segments of quantity rays, mass, charge, temperature, size, etc. Difference in masses, difference in sizes, difference in lengths. Numbers are that way properties of determinable quantities, those determinable quantities that are not superdeterminables. Since determinable quantities are properties, numbers are properties of properties. In the locationist approach I defend, properties are quality regions, so numbers are second-level places, places in which other places are located. Numbers are had by segments. Just a couple of remarks. Numbers are had by segments regardless of this or that choice of a unit of measure. If a segment of the array size is number 3, it has 3 regardless of whether it is measured in inches or centimeters. The choice of a unit of measure or another is a matter of convention, but a segment having a number or another is a matter of fact. Numbers are invariant across all units of measure. Second, numbers are invariant across all fundamental quantities, mass, charge, size, and so on. As to number, mass segments are perfectly comparable to charge segments, size segments, and temperature segments. There is just one system of numerical properties, generically applicable across any superdeterminable quantity. Having the same number is an inter-superdeterminable relation. Third, numbers are monadic properties. As number 3 is true or false of single segments. If numbers are had by segments, it should be possible to analyze the basic algebraic operations on numbers, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, in terms of geometric operations on segments. For any two segments, x and y, in other words, a y has to be found to produce in a limited number of steps, just operating on x and y, a segment z, such that the number of z is the sum, or the product, or difference, the quotient, of the number of x and the number of y. It is not difficult to give a schematic representation of such purely geometric operations. Here I limit myself to addition and multiplication. It's in Italian, sorry. Addition. Consider segment xy and segment zw below. Note that xy has number 2 because its ratio to its bridge x0 is 2 to 1, while wz has number 1 because its ratio to its bridge zeta 0 is 1 to 1. A procedure has to be found that in a finite number of translation and rotation of xy and wz produces a segment having as its number the sum of xy's number and wz's number. That is 2 plus 1 equals 3. Here's a way to produce the required segment. Rotate xy around x and zw around z 90 degrees in opposite direction. Draw a straight line passing through W and 0, and one passing through Y and 0. These two lines. Extend indefinitely Yx beyond X to cut 0W in the point R. Translate YR across X until R lies upon line L.
We have approximately 5 minutes. Approximately 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Nearly finished. Then rotate YR around R 90 degrees towards Z. The number, this is the result. The number of YR is the number of YZ plus the number of ZW. That is 2 plus 1 equals 3. Okay, multiplication. There are two segments, ZW, which is number 2, because it's the twice its bridge, and XY, which is as number 3 because it's 3 times its bridge. Okay, so the shorter one is number 3, the longer one is number 2. Procedure has to be found that in a finite number of translation rotations of XY and WZ produces a segment having as its number the product of XY's number and ZW's number, that is 3 by 2 equals 6. Okay. Rotate XY around X and ZW around Z 90 degrees in opposite direction. Okay. Draw a straight line passing through 0 and W and one passing through 0 and Y. Extend XY indefinitely in both directions so as to obtain a line L prime cutting 0W in point R. Rotate XR 90 degrees toward 0, that way. Draw a straight line parallel to 0 Y passing through R and cutting L prime in the point V. Rotate XV 90 degrees away from 0. This is the result. The number of Vx is the number of XY by the number of ZW, because that segment is 6 times as long as its bridge, x0. Okay. A set of procedures of this kind can be produced for any algebraic operation. Okay. Well, the account of number I have very schematically presented here has some interesting features. It treats quantities as fundamental and numbers as dependent. It employs a Fieldian machinery, Field 1980-2016, to yield a non-Fieldian conclusion. Numbers exist, and we can unproblematically quantify over them. It treats irrational and rational numbers, including integers, on a par, and it completely leaves out of the picture sets, employing geometry instead of set theory as the indispensable theoretical background. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. You are seeing actually a raised hand in WebEx, so let me check what's happening on this side.
Può fare una domanda?
Sì, prego.
Buongiorno a tutti alla conference di Metaphysics di L'Aquila. Allora io chiaramente non conosco, ho seguito con grande interesse i talk di Bottani. Mi sembra però di dover rilevare alcune cose. Allora, rispetto al tema del fatto che è interessante il fatto che Euclide introduca per misurare, cioè il tema della misura, diceva le magnitude, no, posso parlare devo parlare in inglese?
It would be better, yes, it's possible, yes.
Okay, sorry. So, I try, because in mathematics, maybe will be only approximative. But, so, the problem is, I begin with my critic. It's a slightly hard critic. It seems to me at the end of the conclusion of your talk that your talk is not you don't addict. There isn't an addiction. A sort of there is a synthesis. Your assertion are only analytics, not synthetics. It seems to me, sorry for the critic, it seems that you present a sort of, in mathematical terms, automorphism that at the end it is a sort of an auto loop, an automorphism, tautological. I try to explain me. First, the idea.
Please keep
the idea
question
of automorphism
a bit short because there are.
I don't agree with there is an isomorphism between the geometrical and the mathematical and the arithmetical one. Cantor is only his program of research that that for many reasons we couldn't continue. I don't agree. There isn't the very problem, philosophical problem is there is no isomorphism between. You have done a journey into topological games, but Euler, and at the end you as being Cartesian. If you think my objection, the example, counter example, you could represent numbers in an iconic geometrical way on a pie. How do you say torta? As in Excel, a graph. If I take a circle, a proportion, a circle is a unity. Every number is a unity. I don't want to propose a new mathematical one, but 2 is the circle to parse into parts. How do you say torta in Excel? And there is a correspondence between Excel numbers and quantities, and so it's not true that you can't represent what Euclid said that as person has already written many ways and many strong.
Thank you for your question. Not everything is perfectly clear in it to me, but I would just say that if I have said anything tautological, then I'm happy about that, because tautologies are, of course, certainly true. So and there is a sense in which metaphysics is not tautological, but a real metaphysic truth at least according to some, has to be necessary, okay? So if what I say, what I've just said is not only tautological but also necessary, of course this follows. I'm happy about that, yes.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. Just a very short question.
Wittgenstein and Kant didn't agree with you.
Alberto?
Yeah, a very short question. Do you see any connection between your idea and Wittgenstein's idea in the Tractatus that the number is the exponent of an operation? That is, the fact that you said a certain point that, for instance, the number of a segment is the result of the fact that adding a certain ridge a certain number of times.
I think that number, as I conceive of it, is having number 3 is a structural property. And certainly a structural property can be discovered by an operation. I would not say, I'm not happy, would not happy to say that the number is created by the operation. In my intended account, numbers pre-exist operations, but operations can discover numbers. Okay. But there are other, maybe, coincidences between this point of view and the Wittgenstein ones.
Hi. Sorry, unfortunately I wasn't here for the whole talk, but looks very interesting. You must send me a copy of your paper sometime, if it is a paper. Sorry, the question. I'm just worrying about lengths. So absolute length, right, what's that? But you want to depend on relative lengths in this system. And I've got to worry that if we don't really know what absolute length is, relative lengths sort of are also maybe problematic. I'm wondering, are they stipulated in your system, or do you depend on some sort of metric creator, I suppose?
I am a relationalist about quantities. I'm not sympathetic with the idea that a magnitude exists as a monadic property independently of its relations with other magnitudes. And I tend to think that an absolute length cannot be measured and has. I have no intuitive grip on the idea of an absolute length, apart from a division of this length in parts and a comparison between the parts and the whole length, or a comparison between an individual and another length, etc. My key idea is that at the bedrock of reality, you find just bare particulars which locate themselves at certain distances, creating a space of qualities. I'm a nominalist about qualities. It's I'm in a strict minority of philosophers who defend this idea. It's a complex idea. I have no time here to explain in the detail, but that's the intuition, the basic intuition of theory. So the idea is to reduce quantities to particulars and reduce numbers to quantities. So have a nominalistic general project. Okay.
Just a little.
It's difficult to implement it.
Yeah,
I'm making efforts.
Yeah, I didn't quite get all that, but the dynamic elements in the story you tell with the rotations, for example, and also you talk about routes from one point to another, etc. Are they mere metaphors that can be dispensed with in the final theory, or are they essential components?
Routes.
Or even the rotation.
Rotation, yes. this is just a presupposition, general presupposition of any system of geometry. So I take this for granted. But yes, it might be problematized. One could see that as a problem. Yes, it's necessary to have a bidimensional space, of course. And arrays are one-dimensional structures. So if you rotate an array, you are presupposing a bidimensional space, a plane where the array is located. But if you have two arrays, just you have, and probably if reality is a very complex space of quantities, there are huge numbers of dimensions. And I think that science indeed has to find what of these dimensions are really fundamental and reduce the overall number of dimensions and simplify that way the general image of reality.
Okay, one last quick question.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. I have just some consideration to share. I would like to have your feedback about that.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what kind of numbers you can get by using your strategy. For example, I would like to argue that you cannot get complex numbers.
Oh, yes.
So my
yes.
line of reasoning
I have no theory of a complex number. I'm not sure that it cannot be given, but I have no.
So my consideration is the following.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you can get, let's say, real numbers, but then you want to get also complex numbers, but then you want to apply a set theoretical strategy to get complex numbers.
Yeah.
So
maybe.
Why not to have just set theory without your strategy?
Maybe there is no geometric route to complex numbers, and I have maybe some problems even with negative numbers. Okay. Because as I conceive it, point zero is not is an external limit of the ray mass, and the ray is not having zero mass is not having a mass, and zero is not a number in this approach.
Thanks, Andrea. And, in a few minutes, the two parallel sessions begin here and in Aula 08. We can now sit and begin with the first talk of this parallel session. Our speaker is Jan Borner, and the title of the talk is Causation on Several Levels, Supervenience Relations in Causal Models.
Right, yeah, thank you very much, and you are in for a bit of a change of topic. So I would like to address a shortcoming, at least what I consider to be a shortcoming, in interventionists' account of causation, which definitely have come a very long way in representing causal relationships in a very formal and precise way. And they do so by being based on a formalism called structural equation models, or causal models just in short, and I will later give a quick introduction if you're not familiar with these. And they basically use these formal models as a semantics for certain counterfactuals, and then use these counterfactuals in turn to define causal concepts like, well, actual causation, sufficient causation, direct causation, and so on. So I definitely think that these accounts have helped us to better understand and to better grasp how we actually reason about causal relationships, but, and this is the point of the talk, I think these accounts have long neglected non-causal relationships of counterfactual dependence, like, for example, supervenience, or the relation between determinate and determinable, and so on. And because of this, we have a deficiency that intuitively adequate causal claims on different supervenience levels, or on different levels of abstraction, cannot be evaluated relative to one and the same causal model. This is what I will call the expressivity problem, and I will basically try to give a new solution to it. So let's just have a quick look at the structure of the talk. Doesn't work right now.
Yes, just give a click because it needs the focus. Yeah, now.
Okay. Yeah, now it works. Perhaps I talked too long. So I will just give a quick introduction into causal models, as I said. Then we look at a very simple example to what the expressivity problem is, look at two old proposals to solve the expressivity problem, about which I think that have significant downsides, and then we will look at one new proposal. So what are causal models? I think the easiest way to get an understanding of this is to look at a very simple example. So I take one from Jablo in his article Mental Causation, which basically goes like this. Imagine we have some pigeon called Sophie. I think it's not important, but she's always called Sophie, in some kind of laboratory, right? And we can show Sophie some kind of objects. Now, Sophie's trained to pack whenever, well, actually, if and only if the object we show her is red, right? Now, a causal model goes on and says, well, let's represent such a scenario by using certain variables that can take on certain values. So in this case, we just have two variables, O representing the color of the object we show to Sophie, right? Having two values, 1 representing that it's red, 0 representing that it's non-red, and we have P representing whether Sophie packs. Again, two values, 1 representing that she does pack, 0 that she doesn't pack. Now, to represent the causal relationship, we use structural equations. Simple example, simple structural equation. It basically just tells us that P takes on the same value as O. But, and this is quite important, structural equations are considered to be asymmetric. That means we interpret this as saying that the value of O determines the value of P, but not the other way around, right? And to see how this plays out in a causal model, we should first introduce a concept that is, as you can guess, quite important for interventionists' account of causation, namely, well, the concept of an intervention. So what is it? The idea of an intervention is that we can externally manipulate a variable and just put it on a value that we want it to have. So in this example, we can intervene on x, put it on the value small x, and by doing so, we kind of destroy the causal influence from A and B on x, because our intervention alone determines the value of it and not its causes anymore. But we have to make sure that the intervention does not destroy anything else in the causal model. All the other causal relationships remain intact. And very important, we have to make sure that there's no confounding, so I really is allowed only to influence x and none of the other variables directly. Right? And there we can observe when we intervene on x, okay, what are the consequences of this intervention in the causal model? Now the idea is that structural equations are invariant on the interventions on the right-hand side of the equation. So if we intervene here on O and set it on some variable, the equation tells us what value, the structural equation remains valid, and therefore tells us what value P will take on independence of O. But, and there's the asymmetry, if we intervene on the left-hand side of the equation, on the variable, then we destroy, we invalidate basically the structural equation because we just put P on the value that we wanted to have and it's independent of O, right? So this all says that structural equations basically encode certain counterfactual information. This one here, for example, tells us that if we would intervene on O to put it on this and that value, then P would have this and that value. And we now use these counterfactuals to define certain causal concepts, like here, the concept of an actual cause, which is supposed to be token causation, right? We have token events, and actual cause just says that one token event is the cause of another token event. A quick warning, this is a crude simplification of the actual definition. It's much more complicated, but for a very simple example, this is actually enough, right? And the basic idea already is in there. So we say that the event x is x, which just says that the variable x takes on the value x, is an actual cause of another event y is y. Well, if and only if the first condition just says, well, x is x must be the case and y is y must be the case, which is kind of trivial, right? So for one thing to cause another, they both have to be the case. More interesting is the second condition, which says that there must be a counterfactual dependence between the effect and the cause. In the following sense, if we would intervene on the cause variable and set it on some alternative value x prime, then the effect variable would also change its value. But if we then intervene on the cause variable again, put it on its actual value x, the effect variable also takes on its actual value again. So the idea is basically, if we wiggle on the cause variable, we can observe a wiggling in the effect variable, right? This is the idea of actual causation and of this interventionist account of causation, which is just a counterfactual account of causation. There's no causal power going on, no mechanism whatsoever, right? Just counterfactual dependence. Okay, what is the expressivity problem? Just take again our Sophie example. It's just the same situation as before, right? But this time, we can not only determine the color of the target by making of the object by making it red or non-red, right? Some of these more abstract colors, but we can be more concrete. We can actually give it some concrete color shade like crimson, scarlet, maroon, rose, indigo, and so on, which are, as you surely know, determinants of these more abstract color shades like red and non-red, right? P just remains the same, right? Either she packs or she doesn't. Now the causal relationship in this causal model can be represented by the following structural equation. Since we've basically the same causal relationship, she packs whenever it's red, we can write it like this. P is 1 if and only if the object takes on one of the red color shades, right? Now imagine that the object is scarlet that we show to Sophie. So Sophie is triggered and packs, right? We can evaluate the following causal claim relative to this causal model. The object being scarlet is an actual cause of Sophie's packing. Well, both events are the case, and we have the counterfactual relationship. We wiggle here, we see a wiggle there. But there's another intuitive adequate causal claim to this situation, although we can debate this. But this is what I presuppose. The object being red is an actual cause of Sophie's packing. Why do I think this to be intuitive? Well, the object is red. It's scarlet, so it's also red, right? Sophie packs, and again, we can wiggle on the cause and make it non-red, right? And Sophie will not pack. We have the same counterfactual relationship, so the actual cause definition is satisfied. But the problem is we cannot evaluate the second causal claim relative to this causal model. Why? Well, simply because we do not have the value being red in there. We just have not the terminology in the causal model to evaluate this causal claim. And now you might say, well, this is kind of a simple, stupid problem. Just put in the value being red, right? Yeah, but this is not so easy as it turns out, because there are some very well-entrenched rules of causal modeling. And the first one is what I call mutual exclusivity. It's actually very seldomly explicitly discussed, right, these rules, but they are nearly always presupposed in the literature on causal modeling. So the first rule says that the value set of any variable only has mutually exclusive values. So any variable can only take on one value at the same time. But of course, you see, as soon as we put in the value red into this value set, mutual exclusivity is violated, right? So this does not work with the standard approach of causal modeling. Now you might say, okay, then there's another way. Just leave this value set, okay, but just add another variable then. We just put in a second variable, O prime, also describing the color of the object, and here we use the more abstract values to describe the color, right? Mutual exclusivity is satisfied for both. So it seems fine. But no, we have another rule of causal modeling, which Woodward calls independent fixability. And the idea is that we can intervene on any variable in a causal model independently, right? And change the values. This is not the case here. As soon as we intervene on O prime and change it, like, for example, from red to non-red, we also automatically change the value of O because of the supervenience relationship. Okay, so now you might suggest, okay, why follow these rules? Just drop one, right? And I think, yes, this is the right way to go. We should drop one of these rules to solve the expressivity problem. The question is basically which one. And here's an old proposal, which is basically an approach that Woodward follows in the 2015 paper, and he basically says, well, let's get rid of independent fixability, right? He does exactly what we just did and introduces a second variable, right? But as soon as we do so, we have some consequences, and I will not go into all of them, just want to make one point. Imagine that we do not only want to have two supervenience levels, but like 20 different ones, right? then we need not only introduce 20 different variables in our causal model, but we also need to introduce a structural equation for everyone, right? To describe the causal relationship between the variable, the cause variable and the effect variable. And this model then suggests that we have like 20 or 10 or 2 different, completely independent causal relationships there. This is the case because the model does not explicitly represent the supervenience relation between O and O prime in any way. It's just not in there. Of course, we know that scarlet is a determinant of red, right? But as soon as we give this model a computer or an alien, or a computer of an alien, they just will not know that there's this supervenience relationship, right? Right, so this is the intuitive problem with this solution. There's another one, I just want to mention this shortly. The approach basically says, well, let's just bite the bullet and make a causal model for every supervenience level. But of course, we have just the same problem as before, right? We have structural equation for every supervenience level and the suggestion that all these causal relationships do not somehow be dependent on each other, right? And we have no representation of the supervenience relations again. So this is where my new proposal comes into play. Am I good on the time?
Yes, still 6 or 7.
Oh, that's perfect. So the idea is to use a formalism that was introduced by Christian List in a paper in 2019, which is called a system of levels. And a system of levels is basically a pair LS, with L being a set of sets, and these sets are called levels. And S is a set of functions between these levels, and they are called supervenience mappings, for the simple reason that they are supposed to represent the supervenience relationships between the objects and the different levels, right? So for example, the first function from L0 to L1 tells us that x1 and x2 are supervenience base or determinate, whatever, of A1, and so on. Then we have a few conditions on S. For example, we want that S is closed under composition, right? The second one says that for any pair L and L prime, so for any 2 levels, there's at most one mapping from L to L prime. Okay, now the idea is, I think I will not go through the details of the definition, just the basic idea is to say, well, let's use this definition, this concept of a system of levels, and apply it to a causal model. And from now on, we will not say that a variable in a causal model, V, has only one value set. Instead, it has a whole system of value set levels, right? It has several different value sets that form the different levels, and then have functions between them to represent the supervenience relationships. So let's just again look at our very simple example. We can now represent this scenario again by 2 variables only. O representing the color of the object that we show to Sophie, and P whether Sophie packs. But now we can not only use one value set for the color of the target, but just for example 3, right? We could of course use arbitrarily many. And in addition to this, we have our set SO, which contains the supervenience relationships between these different levels. So there are 2 really interesting functions in there, in this set. The first one goes from L0 to L1, and it just maps all the red color shades, like crimson, scarlet, maroon, rose, on the value red in the higher level, right? And then it continues, all the blue color shades on the value blue, and so on. The second one just goes from L1 to L2, and it takes the warm colors like red and yellow and maps it on the value warm color in the higher level. So now we actually have an explicit representation of the supervenience relations in the causal model, right? And as you may notice, this approach is basically a violation of the rule of mutual exclusivity, because a variable can now take on several values at the same time, although those values are all on different levels. But we still should explicate which values on the different levels are compatible with each other. And I do so by introducing two axioms, basically, or two rules, and say if a variable v has the value small v in a level L, then in all higher levels, v takes on a value v tilde that supervenes on v according to the supervenience functions in S, right? And the second one, I think you can already guess how this goes. If a variable v has a value v tilde on a higher level L tilde, then in every lower level L, v has a value that is the supervenience base of v tilde according to the supervenience functions in S, right? Now the beautiful thing is that we can now just use one structural equation to describe the causal relationship between these two variables, right? We just can say, well, Sophie packs P is 1 if and only if O takes on the value red. And now we have introduced all the vocabulary that we actually need, all the values that we need to evaluate causal claims on all these different supervenience levels. Right? We can say the object, imagine it's scarlet again, right? Then we can say the object being red is a cause of Sophie's packing and apply the definition of actual causation, and it turns out to be true. The same for the object being scarlet is a cause of Sophie's packing. And we can even go a higher level, which I introduced here, the object having a warm color, which actually turns out to be no cause of Sophie's packing, because there is a value of a warm color to which I can turn the cause variable on, namely yellow, and Sophie will not pack. Right? This is why this does not satisfy the definition of being an actual cause. Yeah, and this is basically it. Yeah.
Thanks, Jan. Questions?
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering whether maybe the original problem was caused by, a misconception of what are really the causal relata, because it seems to me that this literature takes causal relata to be fact, the object being red, right? But, for instance, Sophie, you have the causal relata when you stick to, let's say, more famous, right? Counterfactual analysis of causation are taken to be events. So the event that Sophie so the causal related in your domain RO, if I remember correct, should be something like Sophie seeing a red object and Sophie seeing what was it, scarlet object. But those are numerically the same events, right? In that instance, okay, in that case. And so this was my doubt about it. And in that case, maybe what you have to do is just to, just restructure your domain RO in order to consider events and not facts. And this was my idea.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is actually a great point, asking what are the relata of causation, and interventionists actually are very proud in saying, well, typically at least, we don't have to say what it really is. We don't really care even if it's facts or events. Typically, the word event is actually used for saying, well, x is x, the variable taken on a certain value. It's often called an event, but most interventionists, I think, do not care what it really is, because we only represent the thing in the actual world. Then he said that you would say it's the same event, right? The object being scarlet and the object being red.
No, not the object being scarlet and the object being red, but Sophie seeing a scarlet object and Sophie seeing a scarlet red object at that time.
Okay.
They are just two different descriptions of the very same event that is taking.
Yeah, so this is probably what I would deny, I would say, because since scarlet is a determinate and there are different ways of being red, seeing a red object is something else still as seeing a scarlet object. But if you would go this way, then you still would have, even if you say, well, it's only different descriptions, you still need a model where you can evaluate the different descriptions. And then we still need need to do the same thing, basically. You have a different ontology, but...
I'm not sure about... I'm not sure you really need... of course, the level stuff you introduced, I'm quite sure it will be working for this proposal, but for this aim. But you may just maybe stick to the first models that you showed us, and just present different R0 domains, right? So R0 with the events of seeing scarlet stuff, maroon stuff, indigo stuff, and then another model with another R0, which includes just seeing what was it, red stuff, I don't know, brown stuff. Okay, so a more coarse-grained domain, if you like.
Yeah.
So you will not have levels. You just will have different domains, so different structural equation. Yeah.
Which would basically be this way, right?
Exactly.
But then you have no representation of the relationships between scarlet and red. It's just not really explicitly modeled.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah. But thanks.
Thanks. This was a great talk, super interesting. And this is a very stupid question, so be patient with me. So you sold the advantage of your proposal mainly in the fact that the proposal that you don't like seems unnecessarily complicated and sort of rich. I was wondering whether you could expand a bit on that, because it seems to me that you lose all the extra structural equation that you need, but you gain functions, right? And it's not completely clear to me that makes such a difference, right? Because you still have to specify all the functions, so when you give the alien the thing, your book is going to be pretty long anyway. So maybe if you could tell me something a bit more, why is it better to have functions plus those couple of axioms that you got, rather than just some extra structural equations?
Right. So you're basically right in saying, well, it's not really so much easier, right? Because now you have all the supervenient structure stuff in there. So if let the model be as easy as possible, I don't know, it's probably a draw, or perhaps I could even lose, I don't know. But the point is more that I want to represent the intuition that the different causal relationships on the different levels somehow are connected. Yeah. And this is the idea, and this is not the case in Woodward's approach. Yeah. So perhaps I can just add this one. There's also the idea that there are two different concepts of causation, right? Ned Hall and also Woodward is talking about this, about thin conception of causation and thick one. And I think the intuition that they are all connected is our thick concept of causation, that there's some kind of causal power going on, some kind of mechanism, which may be only on one level, but the thin concept holds on every level, the counterfactual dependence.
Are there other questions? Otherwise, thanks, Jan.
Thank you.
The next talk will be 10 minutes after 10. It's time for the next talk to start. Erika Ornis is going to talk about weak and strong emergent patterns in virtual and real cellular automata.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So today I will talk about emergent patterns and lizards. So this is a brief overview of the talk. I will introduce this distinction between ontological and non-ontological forms of emergence. Then I'll take into account one very famous example of weak emergence, which are Marc Bedeau's emergent patterns, and the example he took is the one about cellular automata. Then I will suggest that there's actually a cellular automata that can be found in nature, so it's not just a virtual cellular automata. And then we will focus on of some features of these living cellular automata, and then I will draw some conclusions about causal efficacy and emergent causal efficacy. Okay, so about this distinction that it's quite common and known, usually there are many forms of emergence, so it's become customary to talk about stronger ontological or metaphysical forms of emergence, weaker epistemological or conceptual forms of emergence, diachronic, synchronic, etc. So there are these different forms, but despite the many forms of emergence and the many criteria recognized to recognize emergence, I think there's this common distinction between stronger or metaphysical or genuinely ontological forms of emergence, which are usually correlated to novel causal powers or to novel causal profiles, like in Wilson, or more generally to novel causal efficacy. And then there are weaker, metaphysically innocent forms of emergence that are not characterized by novel causal powers or by novel causal efficacy, but are characterized by other features like deductive or theoretical unpredictability, or predictability through step-by-step simulation alone, or the requirement for new concepts or theories to treat these weakly emergent phenomena. Okay, so let's move to a quite famous example of weak emergence, of Marc Bedeau's analysis of emergent patterns. So where can we find these weak emergence instances? We can find them in systems that are composed by lower level microcomponents that are in certain microstates and that produce through their microdynamics D some higher level macrostates. So this is a quote from Bedeau: a macrostate P of the system S with local macrodynamic D is weakly emergent if and only if P can be derived from D and S's external conditions, but only by simulation. So why are we talking about emergence? Are we talking about emergence because, in Bedeau's opinion, the macrostates are constituted by and generated from the underlying processes and components, and the macrostates, however, are autonomous from underlying processes. Now, why weak emergence, however? Well, because there are no novel causal powers involved, no novel causal efficacy. And the example that when this is this quotation about these emergent states being nothing more than the aggregation of the microstates, of the ontological and causal states of its microcomponents. Okay, so this is the classic example, cellular automata. Marc Bedeau took as an example the game of life. Game of life are these discrete dynamical systems that are composed of grids of cells having a finite number of states. So in this case, there are two states, white and black, that correspond to alive and dead. And it is a dynamical system because, as you can see, it moves, which means that it evolves. And evolves, and for each temporal step, how it evolves? It evolves in this way. So each cell updates its state as a function of its neighbor's previous state. So if you're seeing one of the cells that are moving, that are changing, they are changing because the 8 neighboring cells have some states that triggers this change, we can say. And despite the simple local rules governing the micro-level interactions, the system can generate partially autonomous complex macro patterns. So these are some examples. This is a pulsar. These are patterns that are easily recognizable, and they have this development in 3 phases, in 3 temporal phases. So after T3, we have again the pattern that is at T1. And these macro patterns surely have some sophisticated structure and even some gestaltic feature because you immediately recognize them, but just seem actually a curious byproduct of these microdynamics, which are defined by causal rules. This is another example. So, if cellular automata are intended as these virtual computational models that lack any sort of kind of context, it is actually hard to see anything else, and so Bedeau's analysis seems correct. Now, my question is, what happens if we find real embodied CA in nature? So real CA regulating biological processes. And this is why I will talk about lizards. So in 2017, on Nature, a group of biologists working in Geneva published this article, a living mesoscopic cellular automaton made of skin scales. And the skin scales are belonging to that Let's say something about animal coloration in general and patterns in general. In biology, patterns are intended as symmetry-breaking regularities, such as stripes, spots, tessellation, meanders, and labyrinths. So we all know, we all already saw some kind of pigmentation patterns in nature. And usually, pigmentation is produced by cell-level interaction, because the cells have some chemical or physical structure that make them have the colors they have. Well, what is interesting in these animals is that in ocellated lizard, pigmentation patterns are produced at a higher anatomical level, at the level of the scales, not at the level of the cells, but at the level of the scales. And this is the reason why the authors talk about this process as mesoscopic, because it happens between the micro level of the cells and the macro level of the pattern, so at the meso level of the scales. Okay, so there are relevant similarities between the game of life and the ocellated lizard pigmentation processes. The first is that CA, like the game of life, are composed of discrete cells holding finite possible states, like 2, and lizard skin is composed of discrete scales that exhibit a finite number of colors. It is always, again, 2, green or black. The second similarity is that in CA, each cell is updated as a function of the states of the neighbor cells, and this happens also in ocellated lizards, when each scale color is updated as a function of the neighbor scales. We have a different geometrical pattern of the lattice, but the dynamic is the same. And third, in CA, the macrodynamic is regulated by simple local rules. And the same can be said for ocellated lizard. Then in CA, in this case, I'm showing the local rules of an ECA, an elementary cellular automaton, because it's just monodimensional and not bidimensional. But we can see these rules, which can be read like the first square, if the cell is dead or is black, and the 2 neighbor cells are black, the scale, the next step, temporal step, remains black, and so on and so forth. When I don't have a visual representation of the rules about the ocellated lizard, but in ocellated lizard, the number of black scales around green scales increases until it reaches a value of 3, while the number of green scales around black scales increases until it reaches the value of 4. So again, we have local rules producing these patterns. And in this image, you can see on the image below, on the first image, the adult pattern. In the corner, you can see the juvenile pattern, so they are very different. And in the images below, you can see the evolution of the pigmentation patterns in 1 month, 3 months, 5, 30 months, and after 3 years. Okay, so there are actually many similarities between virtual and real CA, but there's at least one big and obvious difference, which is that the pigmentation patterns of the ocellated lizard perform biological functions, so they are not ontologically irrelevant, I think. So what about these functions? So generally speaking, animal coloration has several adaptive functions in nature. So they have functions about intraspecific communication. So some traits can be ornaments or armaments, because they can attract mates or scare other competitors. They are important in interspecific communication, like aposematism suggests. So some animals have these bright colors which tell to possible predators, hey, I'm disgusting, do not eat me. So this is, again, a function of animal pigmentation and animal coloration. Then there's obviously camouflage, thermoregulation, and so on and so forth. So as far as lizards are concerned, patterns perform at least 2 biological functions. The first is that they are an instance of disrupting coloration. So they disrupt the silhouette of the animals, and so they can help it with camouflage. And the second, which is really interesting, I think, is that they carry information about the individual who shows them and serve as badges of status, which means that they are features conveying social status signals. And this is very important in mate competition and reproduction. So, despite the similarity between virtual and real CA, pigmentation patterns in real CA do not seem causally irrelevant. So the answer we could pose is, are they instances of weak emergence, or maybe are they instances of strong emergence? Because they are realized by their components, their development can be predicted, even if only by simulation, but they perform functions that seem different from those of their components. They really seem to have novel causal roles. So we can ask, how should we conceptualize these novel causal roles and efficacy? And one kind of intuitive strategy about this could be, well, maybe we can reduce this causal efficacy. So the next question is, are these functions and roles reducible to those of the components? And I think this is difficult to do, because in classical accounts of realization, what David Yates defined as a functional realization, the powers of the realized property are derived from those of its realizers. So you have these realized phenomena, and they seem to have some causal powers or some causal efficacy, but actually those causal powers are causal powers of the realizers. The problem is that no particular causal roles has to be filled by the lower level components to have pigmentation patterns, because all is needed are certain spatial relationships holding between the colors of the scales. So I think that to conceptualize this kind of realization, because it's still a realization, we can use the notion of qualitative realization formulated by David Yates. So in qualitative realization, the realizer do not realize the realized property by bestowing causal powers, but rather by meeting certain non-causal specifications that in this case are spatial, I think, and just structural. So, conclusions. I think that in this paper we dealt with a case of what can be legitimately defined as a macroscopic or high-level causal or functional novelty. And given that the kind of realization involved by pigmentation patterns seems qualitative rather than functional, so not requiring any power filling the causal roles of the higher level entity, a different approach to emergent causal efficacy might be beneficial to the economy and evolution of the debate. So the question is, how should we conceptualize the kind of causal efficacy characterizing pigmentation patterns? And I think that the most intuitive answer here is through the notion of semantic information exchange, rather than through the notion of causal power exertion. So, if semantic information exchange is taken as essential in biological causal processes such as this one, we'll have a complex structure explaining the efficacy of the patterns. So this is a structure that I took from Gottfried Smith. So there are some states of the world that are the social features of the animal, of the pattern, of the lizard. Then there is the sender, which are the pigmentation patterns. Then there's the signal, which is the piece of information about the social status of the animal. Then there's the receiver, which can be a male, a competing male or a female. And then there are the acts, which are the functional reaction of the receiver after understanding or just receiving the signal. So, and this is my conclusion, I think that in oscillated lizards, the pigmentation pattern is ontologically emergent because it is produced by a certain evolutionary process, EP, involving the appearance of a relational structure S that makes possible a semantic information exchange. So this is not really a schema for emergence. It's just a description. It's just a description and an explanation about why these phenomena can be considered emergent or can be seen as emergent. And it's a description that cannot really just be generalized universally, okay? So I just took in consideration this specific case, and I tried to understand why it seems emergent and why it doesn't really seem just weakly emergent to me. And these are my conclusions, so thank you.
Thanks a lot, Erika. Questions, Jessica?
Thank you so much, Erika. That was so fascinating.
Thank
you. One thing I just wanted, this is more just of a comment. It seems to me that you're getting at something quite interesting that was also suggested by Murali Ramachandran in a question to me after, I think it was at the workshop. Yeah, at the workshop. When he was mentioning how if you were an anti-individualist, you might think the brain state could have powers the mental state could have powers, semantic powers perhaps, right? That the brain state doesn't have, at least not locally, right? So if you were thinking that the brain state was kind of the local realizer, there's semantic features which are actually broad, right, that the brain state is realizing, then would that be a case of strong emergence in the idea of having a novel causal power, or would there be a way of making sense of that in weak emergentist terms? And my response, which I don't think he found very satisfying, but this is kind of the standard move, is to go broad with the base level feature, spatiotemporally broad. But I think your lizard case is, in a way, it has a similar structure where if the powers of the pattern are in fact serving these kind of semantic and broadly and also this touches base with some things that Francesca was saying as well, these broad semantic or evolutionary. Well, I guess this was like part of my question to you. Like what if biochemical kinds are associated with evolutionary processes? Then do we have to have realizers that are really very, very broad? So anyway, I just wanted to say, I think, as a result of this conference, your talk and these considerations, I'm thinking, okay, I think we need a better answer to try how to make sense of that, because I do feel like intuitively the weak emergentist or the physicalist should be able to make sense of these, but there does seem to be kind of a mismatch between the sort of broad powers associated with the higher level pattern and the local realizers, which are not so, in the first instance, not so spatiotemporally broad. So it's kind of a puzzle, I think, for me.
Okay, thank you very much for this contribution, for these ideas. Well, I try to avoid talking about powers, because exactly in these days, talking with many of you, I understood how talk of powers is complex and it's multidimensional, so not everybody think about powers in the same way. So I tried to avoid talking about powers, but I imagined that maybe someone could say to me, well, these patterns just have the power of providing information, or maybe we can see information just because our brain or our minds, our consciousness have some powers of interpreting these signals or to see these signals. And I think that actually maybe we can do that, but I think that just focusing on the powers of the patterns or the power of the mind loses this relational structure, which is really important in the evolution of these patterns, because the evolution of the patterns has been produced by the relationship between the individuals and the environment. And I think that this is something that we really should take into account, especially in biological cases. So this is why I suggest that the one I showed is a more complex structure that can explain these phenomena better than the idea that there's just something like an individual, even if just composed of parts, having some power. Because you have to choose which individual I think is more important, the individual having intentional states or the lizard having some forms in pigmentation, but maybe there's a loss of the link, the relationship between both. However, thank you very much.
Hi, Erika. Thanks very much. This is really, really cool. I just wanted to say that, I don't understand why at the end you just don't play your talk about emergence, saying, but this is just a description of emergence. I think you are onto something here, and you have a broad range of examples from the philosophy of biology that you can use to argue that, well, when we're talking about emergence, most of the times emergence in biological system happens mostly through the interaction with the environment. So we know that biological systems are almost always coupled with the environment, and there are a variety of phenomena like, classic Lamarckian acquired character, Lewontin exapted things that you can use to argue that what looks like strong emergence really is strong emergence, but we don't have to understand emergence as emergent from a base level, rather emergence from interaction of the system with the environment. So I don't think it's just descriptive. I think it's you're onto something.
Okay, thanks. Maybe I was just scared to say something like, oh, well, this is a schema that we can just generalize and explain a lot of biological phenomena, or maybe all biological phenomena. Yes, I think that in biological phenomena, the relationship with the environment is essential, so we also have to take into consideration that. But in this specific case, this is a structure that emerge thanks to the interaction which are of a particular kind, so they can be reproduced through computation using a cellular automata. This is a kind of specific case. So probably this can be generalized for lizards and for vertebrates with these kind of patterns. But the specific mechanism, the specific evolutionary process, the specific relational structure, I think they are really characteristic of these cases. And I think that these cases do not represent some features that I think that are equally important in other kind of biological processes, like the ones that I talk about during the workshop, like the constraining relationship. Here we do not really have a constraining relation from the pattern to the scale, because the patterns are just emergent on the microdynamics, so we don't have a top-down constraining relationship, which is something that instead I think are important in like ant colonies or societies. So this is a description because I think that that's risky to make too strong generalization. Okay. However, thank you.
Thank you very much. This was super interesting. I think I have two comments. I will start from the last one that builds on what we have been saying now. That is, so if, like, you must have in mind a very broad definition of emergence then, because if, like, so my next question was, what does accumulates in a substantive way the case in which we have a constraining relations, such as in the case of, like, ant colonies and cases like these ones? Whether is this just, like, a conception of, like, combination of autonomy and dependence? But then my concern is whether like emergence becomes too broad, because then everything can count as emergence once we have a bit of dependence and a bit of autonomy, given that this case seems to be so different.
Okay. Well, surely I have a broader conception of emergence than many other. But because I'd like to start from cases, so I just don't want to draw schemas and then search in nature or in the world if some cases respect my schemas. I'd like to do the other way around. And this is also the reason why this is a description for me and not just a schema. And so yes, my conception of emergence is broader. And my conception of strong emergence, of just ontological emergence, is that we just have causal relevance. So we just have maybe are more about difference maker theorists more than these causal powers theorists. So I don't think that we always need causal powers. We sometimes need causal powers because in certain ontological domains we have them probably, and they play a relevant role in causal processes. But I don't think that this idea of causal powers can work smoothly. Maybe with a lot of studying and a lot of analysis it can, but like I said, it's more intuitive to just talk about information exchange, and I think that is causally relevant. So this exchange of information, of semantic information, they can be considered informational difference makers. This is a proposal of Jablonka and other guys. So, thank you.
Thank you, Erika. It's a great talk. So, just two quick questions. At the end of the day, it seems to me that following what you said about Bedeau and the conception of weak emergence of Bedeau's and many others, it seems that weak emergence and strong emergence are now to be compatible with each other. So, weak emergence is something which is more about the way in which the emergent features or the emergent entities come from something else, whereas strong emergence is more about the emergent feature does or do in the universe or can do in the universe. Do you agree with this idea?
Okay, I think this is, I don't totally agree, but I think this is just a terminological problem. I mean, I really take weak emergence as just epistemological, but not because I think that there are cases of weak emergence that are just epistemic. I think that when we talk about ontological or epistemic emergence or weak or strong emergence, we are just relying on the kind of criteria that we choose. So if we're relying on epistemic criteria, we will have weak emergence. If we rely on ontological criteria, we have a strong emergence. So I think that a case of emergence can be both weak and strong. It is strong the moment we find that actually the phenomena has some causal relevance, and obviously it will imply some unpredictability, so it is both strong and weak. Otherwise, if it just manifests some predictability, maybe this is just weak, but this is weak because maybe we don't understand, we already know how to realize, how to reduce that, or how to explain through just a physical concept. This is an idea which is very similar to the British emergentist original idea of emergence.
Yeah, okay, but the weak emergentist is an ontological emergentist. So, for example, Bedeau says, I believe that weak emergence is not just an epistemic form of emergence because the unpredictability, the incompressibility, or these epistemic features derive from some features about the universe, the irreducible laws following the...
Yes, they are real features of the world. Incompressibility, nonlinearity are real features of the world.
Another quick question is about the powers. So,
I'll try.
I was wondering, but it's a huge question, why you are not inclined to see the semantic information in terms of powers, but this derives from maybe your understanding of causation, causal power, so it's a huge discussion. But the role of the relation, for example, between the interpreter and the signal in semantic information transmission. So you say it is important to have this sort of relation. So in terms of powers, one could use, for example, the mutual manifestation model, according to which you have a power on behalf of the interpreter and another power on behalf of the message, and these powers are so connected, are connected in such a way that they must be together in order to activate each other. So this may be one way to understand in terms of powers what.
Yes, thank you. This is a very good suggestion, and it's not that I am excluding it. I think that the structure, the relational structure, can be integrated by powers. It's just that, as I said, I tend to exclude. I mean, today, I try to exclude this talk because, as I said, I know that there's not just a univocal interpretation, understanding of powers, and as I said also during the workshop, I think that when we talk, when we find the talk of powers in the debate about emergence, often these powers have some features that are more advantageous for reductionist strategies. So I think maybe we can try to conceptualize this kind of emergent efficacy, not relying on these notions, because it easily opens the way to criticism. But yes, maybe this is definitely something that I can integrate in the schema. So thank you very much. And I also want to like Michele, because he helped me a lot to clarify these ideas that I today show you.
Thanks, Erika. This talk was so cool. So I think that one nice effect, so when you talk about sort of encoding semantical information, I think that probably the way in which we have to cache it out if we want to keep it naturalistic is in sort of teleosemantic terms, which would mean that the sort of basis would be incredibly broad. And so you've got a sort of your pattern, which is generated automatically, and then it becomes emergent because incredibly broad historical and sort of environmental informations. And I think that one of the coolest consequences of that would be that I think that you have a good answer to one of Michele's questions or problems to Jessica, in that, well, why this set of powers are those that sort of pick out that emerging feature as opposed to another. And obviously, in part, it's an empirical question, but you can sort of make it more precise and say, well, we've got all this sort of teleosemantic reason in that, well, historically, this set of patterns became the sort of information-conveying things that this biological system can have. And that seems to me a rich and informative explanation that you can access to. So I think it's really cool. Basically, more than a question, it's like, I think that this is great.
Okay, thank you. You really always talk about powers, so sometimes I'm a bit difficult, but yes, this is a great suggestion, and yeah, it seems that really you are pushing me to put powers in that structure. So maybe I can do that. Okay, be cool. No, Andrea says I shouldn't do that.
You don't need semantic powers. You can just have good old sort of naturalistic stuff.
Okay.
Which I think it's a good thing, right?
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And just one final, like a kind of alternative way of trying to incorporate the good kind of powers. I think another thing a naturalist or weak emergentist might try to say is that actually it's the conditions of instantiation of the powers. You know, you basically shove all the semantic complexity into the environment. So the power would be local, right? And it would be possessed by the underlying, local realizer of the pattern. But the idea is that among the many, incredibly varied powers of that underlying realizer would be that in context where there was this and that evolutionary ... cash it out in very complex physical terms, then it would have the power to produce a certain kind of semantic signal. Now, of course, that's presupposing that there's these semantic features could be given a physically acceptable thing, but I think that's how that might work.
Please keep the answer rather short.
Okay, well, my quick answer is that yes, I'll try to develop that point, and obviously I'm not sure if this passes, but maybe just repeating myself. But I think that these powers or these semantic information is completely naturalistic. So, thank you very much for all this contribution. Thanks.
Thanks, Erika. So. The next talk is the talk by Bruno Cortesi, and the title is Revelation, a Guide for the Perplexed.
Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for being here. So I want to start with a quotation. So these are the very first lines from the Conscious Mind by David Chalmers, so I guess many of you will already be familiar with this. But anyway, so Chalmers writes, "We know consciousness far more intimately than we know the rest of the world, but we understand the rest of the world far better than we understand consciousness. Consciousness can be startlingly intense. It is the most vivid of phenomena. Nothing is most real to us, but it can be frustratingly diaphanous." Now, as you can see, the verb to know appears twice here. And yet, one might wonder, I think, whether it is used, or at least whether it should be used to refer to the same kind of cognitive achievement in both the times it occurs, or whether instead it is used to refer to two different things. So what my presentation today will be aimed at suggesting, and what my doctoral research in general is aimed at arguing, is that the knowledge we have of our own phenomenal conscious states, that is, of those states, there is something it is like to begin is fundamentally different in kind from the one we have of, say, what a proton is, or what a virus is, or what an earthquake is, that is what Chalmers calls the rest of the world. I also take it that it is because we know consciousness so intimately that it resists naturalistic, reductive explanation, such as the one that has been offered for basically almost any other thing, at least since the development of modern science. So the mysteriousness of consciousness with respect to a naturalistic viewpoint broadly construed, that is what Chalmers calls the art problem of consciousness, is rooted in its being more vivid than anything else to anyone who has ever been conscious. So this, just in a nutshell, is what it takes to be the core of the so-called thesis of revelation or revelation hypothesis in the philosophy of mind. and a hint of the consequences might have upon materialist or physicalist framework broadly construed about the mind and about reality in general. It also follows from this, I think, that even thinking about addressing the art problem of consciousness without ipso addressing also the epistemological issue of our relation with phenomenal properties won't do the work, so it will be inevitably doomed to fail as an endeavor. So the art problem of consciousness forces us to reconsider the way in which we know phenomenal property. That of course the reverse is also true, that is, epistemological considerations might have a huge metaphysical importance. So revelation has come in the philosophical literature elementary in a variety of slightly divergent formulations. As I understand it, in its core, it is the thesis whereby phenomenally conscious mental events have the potential to reveal their nature to a subject experiencing them just in virtue of their being and introspected by its subject. So to have an experience, that is, to be acquainted with it, is to know its nature. So just by having, say, a headache, one is put in a position to come to know what pain, or better, the specific painfulness of her experience essentially is. Now, it is widely agreed that although at least some moderate versions of revelation might strike us as prima facie intuitive and perhaps even plausible up to a certain extent, most of them are nonetheless inconsistent with almost any coherent form of physicalism about phenomenal property. So, Lewis' paper, should a materialist be in qualia, is arguably one of the loci we might have a look at, where this sort of tension between revelation and physicalism emerges most clearly. So there is writes, unfortunately there is more to the full psychological concept of qualia than I have yet said. It concerns the modus operandi of qualia. Full psychology says, I think, that we identify the qualia of our experiences. We know exactly what they are, and that in an uncommonly demanding and literal sense of knowing what. And then he goes on, and later he says, if qualia are physical properties of experiences, and experiences in turn are physical events, then it is certain that we seldom, if ever, know the nature of the qualia of our experiences. Making discoveries in neurophysiology is not so easy. So the main idea Lewis is here trying to convey is rather straightforward. On the one hand, as Philip Goff, among others, has also emphasized, we seem to be in a rather peculiar, not to say unique, distinct situation with respect to the phenomenal properties of our experiences. So Goff says, surely you know exactly what your pain is, what it is for someone to be pain in precisely that way, just by attending to pain and thinking about it in terms of how it feels. There is nothing in any way, either for you, about the reality of how you're feeling. Nor is it possible that you're not really feeling that way. And that's because the feeling is right there for you in such a way that its reality cannot be doubted. Still, of course, it is obviously not the case that one can come to make discoveries about fundamental particles just by, say, being in pain and attending to it, or being bored, or seeing at surface, and so on and so forth. So, in the face of this sort of impasse, two options apparently are presented to us. According to the first option, which I call non-rev, our access to the phenomenology of our own conscious states does not indeed have any or most of the special features, so to say, it would appear to have prima facie. So non-rev is compatible with any version of physicalism about phenomenal properties. According to the second option, by contrast, which I call rev, the nature of the phenomenal properties of our own mental states is revealed to us by the mere instantiation and attentive awareness of them. If so, then those properties are arguably not identical nor completely reducible to a number of physical properties or physical states. So, thus far, the issue of the alleged tension between revelation and physicalism, at least as far as I know, has mostly been put in the literature in terms of phenomenal concepts and or some kind of special feature against, so to say, those concepts would allegedly exist. So these are those concepts which refer to phenomenal properties and characterize them in terms of the peculiar qualities they exhibit. The roots of this sort of approach, I think, are to be traced back to Kripke's and Putnam's seminal work in the 70s. In fact, so according to what may be called the received view of reference and meaning, the way in which the reference of a term is picked, that is what is typically called the intension of the term, determines the set of entities to which that term refers, that is the extension of the term by providing a set of conditions, and according to some authors, even a criterion for belonging to that set. It follows that under such an approach that while two terms that may differ in intention while sharing the same extension, as in the Morning Star versus Evening Star case, the reverse is not possible. So two terms cannot differ in extension without also differing also in intention. So contra the received view, both Kripke and Putnam urged us not to conflate the way in which the reference of a term is picked or fixed in a given possible world, and that world is actual, which pertains to the psychological epistemological domain and corresponds with some level of approximation to what Chalmers calls the primary intention of a concept, with the set of entities that term or concept refers to, and or the essence of that which is referred to, which instead pertains to the metaphysical domain, and again, roughly correspond to what Chalmers calls the secondary intention of the same concept. I think I'll just skip this. So, crucially for the purposes of what I want to say, however, both Kripke and Chalmers agree that there is one crucial exception to the framework I just sketched. In fact, this exception is constituted by phenomenal concept or terms. In fact, phenomenal concepts are the only concepts whose primary and secondary intention coincide, or if you want, they constitute the only case in which the metaphysical domain conlaps on the epistemological and vice versa. So to put the matter in the way that it puts it in consciousness, esse est parallel. So typically the primary intention of a concept is picked by pointing to a contingent property of that which is referred to. So take, for instance, the concept of bit. The primary intention of the concept of bit would be picked by, would be something like the phenomenon which causes the sensation S in humans. Some empirical research has now been performed, and so we know that it is essentially molecular motion. So we are able to identify it with molecular motion in any possible world, including one where the sensation S is not had by human at all, or even one with no conscious subject whatsoever. Consider now pain, however. So the referent of the phenomenal concept pain presumably is picked by pointing to a certain class of experiences which share the same phenomenal character, namely painful experiences. This, however, is not a contingent property of pain. In fact, to be painful just is to be an instance of pain. So, while it is perfectly possible to conceive a world where the sensation S is caused in humans by something other than molecular motion, to conceive a world where painful sensations arise by humans in the very first place again, just is to conceive a world where pain exists. An analogous approach is also pursued by people like Goff and Illusory. So Illusory argues that phenomenal concepts are actually independent, that is, just by having a built-in phenomenal concept, one gets to grasp the phenomenal property that concepts refers to. Likewise, Goff says that phenomenal concepts are transparent, where a concept is said to be so, just in case it reveals the nature of the entity it refers to, in the sense that it is a priori what it is for that entity to be part of reality. What I want to suggest is that while it is true that phenomenal concepts are transparent or actually independent in the sense these authors have in mind, this feature of them in turn is grounded on a more primitive, non-propositional, preconceptual kind of knowledge, which I argue may be understood in analogy to complete, drawing by analogy on Levin's distinction between implicit and explicit self-knowledge of thought, as labeled acquaintance as knowledge, or simply acquaintance knowledge to be distinguished from propositional knowledge by acquaintance. so as I think you will already know, Russell distinguished between two kinds of knowledge one might have, namely knowledge of truths and knowledge of things. So basically, knowledge of truths is standard propositional knowledge. It is the kind of knowledge one has when she knows that something is the case. Knowledge of things, by contrast, is a kind of objectual knowledge in the sense that what is known is an item rather than a proposition. The latter kind of knowledge, in turn, can come in two varieties, namely knowledge by description and knowledge by acquaintance. So, knowledge by description depends, at least in part, on the subject having at least some knowledge of truth about the art she knows. Knowledge by acquaintance, by contrast, is said by Russell to be simpler and logically independent from knowledge of truths. It is also a kind of direct knowledge. That is, we know by acquaintance those items we are immediately and indirectly aware of or presented with. So, we may assume that one gets aware of in introspection are our own conscious states. Given this assumption, we get Justina's definition of introspective acquaintance knowledge, whereby introspective knowledge by acquaintance or acquaintance knowledge, and I'll come to that in a moment, is the knowledge of our own phenomenal conscious states, which we have by being introspectively aware of them. So, the very use of the preposition by in the expression knowledge by acquaintance can generate an ambiguity. In fact, there can be at least two readings of that notion. A causal reading and a constitutive one. So under a causal reading of the notion of knowledge by acquaintance, the expression of knowledge by acquaintance is read as the kind of knowledge which is caused by acquaintance. So on these views, the relation of introspective acquaintance plays no other epistemic role but to cause or enable or perhaps even justify knowledge by acquaintance, but crucially it is not epistemically relevant in itself. Typically, moreover, causal views take knowledge by acquaintance to be propositional in kind, thus not sui generis, where a kind of knowledge is said to be sui generis if it is not reducible to any other kind of knowledge. So, on these views, the only possible sui generis kind of knowledge one might have are propositional knowledge and possibly knowledge of. On a constitutive reading of the notion of knowledge by acquaintance, by contrast, the expression knowledge by acquaintance is read as the kind of knowledge which is constituted rather than merely caused by acquaintance. So, on this family of views, the relation of introspective acquaintance is in itself a sui generis, that is non-propositional kind of knowledge. So, constitutive views, even though still regarded as a rather unorthodox position as a minority, are now partially gaining momentum and are held by, among others, possibly Russell himself, Anna Justina, Matt Duncan, Sam Coleman, and a bunch of other people. For what it's worth, this is also the view I myself endorse. So, there are a number of arguments that may be provided for a constitutive account of the notion of knowledge by acquaintance. It is beyond the scope of this talk to enter into the detail of each of them, and also I don't want to run out of time. So I just limit myself to briefly mention those that strike me as particularly cogent. So first of all, as Matt Duncan has noted, phenomenal experience per se appears to exhibit a number of hallmarks, so to say, that overall contribute to create the impression of a rational or otherwise normative status that is parallel to that of justification for beliefs. So take, for instance, perceptual experiences. It seems that perceptions are, at least up to a certain extent, rationally adjustable and under our control. In fact, we can choose what to focus on, adjust our perceptions via learning and habituation, dismiss certain experiences as non-veridical, like, for instance, hallucinations, and so on. Moreover, as Anna Justina has also remarked, attention might be regarded as playing a role analogous to that played by justification in ordinary propositional knowledge. So just as justify a belief is typically taken to mean to provide reasons for why it should be taken as true, under this approach to justify an experience would amount to providing reasons for its being veridical. For instance, I was paying attention. Then there are some arguments, Justina and Pete draw whereby, so basically the acquisition of phenomenal concepts and or the immediate identification and recognition of phenomenal experience will be mysterious or even impossible if a kind of preconceptual grasping of the nature of good experiences did not exist. So here you can find a sketch of the structure of the argument Justina draws. Again, I don't think there's time to discuss this in detail, but anyway, this will just to give you a rough idea. Then there are an epistemic, an argument which again Justina draws, which appeals to cases of where there seems to be an epistemic asymmetry between subjects which is not exhausted by differences in the amount of possessed propositional knowledge. So suppose there's someone who has, for some reason, has never felt pain in his life, not even once, and you're trying to describe to him what pain feels like. Now, there seems to be a rather strong intuitive sense whereby no matter how hard you try, you won't be able to find a non-trivial, non-circular definition of the peculiar quality of pain. So this person will always miss something actually arguably quite important. So to conclude and spell out my position, I do believe that we have a kind of non-propositional, preconceptual acquaintance knowledge of our own phenomenal conscious states. I also do think that this might have severe consequences upon a materialist or physicalist framework well construed about the mind and about reality in general. People like Duncan and Justina said, contemplating the idea that phenomenal experience might be in itself a peculiar kind of knowledge and shed light on our notion of knowledge overall. There are also some possible issues left open that might be worth addressing, such as, for instance, whether introspective acquaintance knowledge is infallible, again, what is the role of attention in it, and whether it is the only possible kind of acquaintance knowledge one might have, or whether instead there might be other possible kinds of acquaintance knowledge, such as, for instance, intuitional acquaintance knowledge, perceptual acquaintance knowledge, and so on. I also do think that paying to the thesis of revelation and to the view that experiences knowledge the attention they merit might be a way of defending the role of the humanities and so things like literature and poetry in academia, in our cognitive endeavor, and in our life in general. Anyway, here I want to elaborate on this point. So I guess that was basically it. So thank you for your attention, and here are some of the references I used. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Bruno. Questions?
Thank you. A lot of different simulations here. I just want to ask you, acquaintance per se, as you said by quoting Russell, might be addressed also to items that are not conscious states. Russell was very generous in saying that maybe we can have even acquaintance of universals, for instance. And in that case, is it possible to say that there is a possibility for us to the nature of things to be revealed itself? Or is the thesis, so to speak, just narrowed down to the scope of phenomenal concepts insofar as they constitute our conscious mental states? And if this is the case, seems that there is a sort of difference between introspective knowledge of acquaintance and knowledge of acquaintance per se when this is addressed as to items. For instance, consider Chalmers' idea that perception might be Edenic. If perception were Edenic, we would have revelations, say, of colors taken as primitives, things, but outside the mind.
No, here I taken for granted that, as I said, what we have access to in introspection our own phenomenal conscious states. This, of course, is not uncontroversial. I'm not sure whether Russell would agree, for instance. I think he says that, at least in the problems of philosophy, he says that one gets aware of in introspection are actually the same data which make up the physical objects. And I think at some point he said something like sense data are mind independent or something. Also, I've been neutral here on whether there may be other possible kinds of acquaintance knowledge. But for instance, there are authors in the philosophy of math who believe that so when you sort of grasp the truth or the correctness of a theorem or a proof or something, you basically get acquainted with it in a sort of direct way. So yeah, I'm open to the possibility that there might be other possible kinds of acquaintance knowledge, of nature revealing acquaintance knowledge, but I stay neutral on this. But
because
that might be.
If I just have time to a quick reply. You said at a certain point in the slide that introspective knowledge might, in a way, explain why there is a symmetry between subjects. And this is something that knowledge by acquaintance per se would not, so to speak, present. That is, if for some reasons I were able to know colors by acquaintance, that would know such a thing as a privileged access for me to know via acquaintance colors, whereas in the case of my conscious mental states, possibly introspective knowledge by acquaintance seems, as you said, to provide this justification.
So, yeah, I quite agree with you. I mean, I think phenomenal conscious states are related to that kind of things, and really special. And that's why I believe basically the knowledge we have of them is actually matter revealing, essence revealing. I'm not sure whether the same is true for other possible items of knowledge. I doubt it. So again, here I really limited myself to phenomenal conscious states, the kind of knowledge we have of them, and
Thanks. So my question is just a clarificatory question. So I was wondering whether you, I think we have discussed about that another time, but so hearing you talking about this reminded me of some old readings of Husserl about when he talks about like categorical intuitions and this kind of intentional access, right, to these things. And it reminded me of this idea of getting this kind of probably preconceptual access to the essence of things, right? And then you're capable basically of grasping the essence of things just via this categorical intuition. And then I don't remember anymore if after that this is related to the noemata or something like that, but I don't remember. So is this related to that kind of idea?
This is, I would say this is definitely Husserlian in inspiration. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to sort of translate that kind of insights and ideas in a sort of more analytic style. But yeah, that is definitely already present in Husserl. The problem then is how you use this kind of preconceptual knowledge of the essence of our own experiences to ground judgments and then propositional knowledge, and then at the end of the day communication and so on. But yeah, this is...
And just a follow-up, out of curiosity, it's interesting the open problem that you mentioned. So what is it that you think about the fallibility, infallibility of this kind of knowledge? I would say that they should be fallible, but what are your feelings?
You would say that it should be fallible or infallible? I didn't get what you...
I think it should be fallible, but what do you think?
I think it might be infallible provided at least a minimal amount of attention. Of course, it is not that easy to quantify what the proper amount of attention is, of course, but so it is debated in the literature whether just acquaintance per se suffices for knowledge, or whether instead it is just one of the essential components of introspective acquaintance knowledge, but not the sole one. So, for instance, attention might also be required, and I would be inclined to say that at least a minimal amount of attention is also required. So, you don't just get to know whatever experience you have just by having it. You need to focus on that.
Okay.
But
okay, so that is the introspective part.
Okay, thank you for the talk. I'm totally on board with some of what you said, so happy with this kind of knowledge by acquaintance. But I'm wondering if you could say a little more about why you think there are severe consequences for physicalism, which follow from this kind of knowledge by acquaintance thesis. Because it seemed to me that clearly the fact that there are differences in one kind of property to another doesn't entail that one of the kinds of properties of the other kind isn't physical. For instance, there are differences between spin and mass, but both of them are physical properties. Similarly, the fact that there's a difference between how we know about one kind of property versus how we know about another kind of property doesn't entail that one of those kinds of properties isn't physical. So I know that my parents are back in the United States, but I know that you're in front of those things in different ways, but they're both physical properties. So I'm just wondering if those aren't the arguments, which those kinds of objections seem to show to me that they aren't, what is the argument that this kind of knowledge by acquaintance thesis undermines the possibility of some kind of coherent physicalism?
So I would say a couple of things on this. First of all, so of course this actually depends on what version of physicalism or materialism or demand you endorse, but it seems to me that at the end of the day, a physicalist would say, well, of course you can know what pain is even if you've never felt pain, not even once in your life. You go in the lab, you study how the brain works, you do some research, and you get to know what pain is. And honestly, I really cannot know, I really struggle to understand how one could possibly know what pain actually is without having felt it himself. And that's the first point. The second point I wanted to underline is that there is an argument, for instance, Martina Niederrummelen draws, which is based on which goes roughly like this. So, if experiences are physical states or are physical in nature, then in theory you should be able to grasp their nature via physical concepts. If you grasp the nature of something via two different kind of concepts, and keep in mind that you're grasping the nature of them, so you're really getting at what they are, then you should be able to understand that those concepts are coextensive, but this is not the case, but you grasp the nature of phenomenal experiences via phenomenal concepts, so physicalism is present. So this would be sort of a very rough idea. But of course then there are counter objections, so it's tricky.
Thanks, Bruno. Thanks, everyone. And then we have our usual, coffee break in the cafeteria in front of the main entrance of the building. And we meet again at 11:35 for the next talk. It is a pleasure for me to introduce the talk of Giorgio Mazzullo, who is an alumnus of this university and now a PhD candidate at the University of Nottingham. The title of the talk is Monist Naive Realism and the Character Question.
Thank you, Giorgio. Thanks to the conference organizers for this amazing conference. So my talk is about the metaphysics of experiential properties, and more specifically about those phenomenally conscious properties that are involved in cases of conscious perceptions and hallucinations. And I'm interested in particular in a view that has received quite a lot of attention in the last 15 years, I would say, that is called naive realism. Naive realism is a view about conscious perceptions, so cases where things go right, let's say. And the view is usually advertised as a view that in a way accommodates some data or like the common sense view about perception, because the basic idea is that so when I see a red apple before me, there is something it is like for me to undergo this experience, contrary to what happens in other sorts of mental states. And naive realism says that basically the phenomenal character, so what it is like for me to undergo conscious perceptions, is constituted by a relation of conscious acquaintance between a subject and aspects of her mind-independent environment. So naive realists literally take experiential events as having mind-independent objects as constituents of the events. And from this general characterization, we can sort of derive these two further theses. One is what I call the constituency thesis that follows for the claim of constituency. And the idea is that the phenomenal character ontologically depends on those mind-independent constituents. And the other one is, following Campbell, what we can call the inheritance thesis, that is a claim of metaphysical determination. And as I understand it, the idea is that like the phenomenal character of the experience of conscious perception is literally inherited from or determined by the actual character of the objects we are acquainted with. So the apple's redness, shape, and so on. So as you might know, naive realism is challenged by arguments from hallucination, and typically philosophers invoke these sort of cases, perfect hallucinations, and the basic idea is that take a conscious perception of a red apple. We know that there are some goings on in the brain, there is some physical activity going on in the brain. And the idea is that we can try and reproduce this sort of activity that is going on in the brain in a situation where there is not perception anymore. And the idea is that a subject would undergo an experience which is indistinguishable from the initial perception. So by mere reproduction of a brain state, we can get an experience which is indistinguishable from a conscious perception of an F. And typically, naive realists are disjunctivists, so they think that these sort of cases, perfect hallucinations, do not have a naive realist characterization. Whatever the account we provide is not naive realist. And so the idea is that they provide a disjunctive account of sensory experiences, so this more like general category. And so a sensory experience as of a red apple is either like a genuine perception with a naive realist phenomenal character, or is a mere hallucination and it has a different sort of account. They shouldn't be particularly interested in what this account might be. It might be a representational account, it might be an account in terms of mental objects. But there is a more challenging argument from hallucination that has been presented by Martin in a series of very influential papers. And this this argument allegedly forces the naive realist to accept the claim that whatever sort of phenomenal character perfect hallucination have, the very same sort of phenomenal character is the one possessed by perceptions. And of course, this is a problem for naive realists because it seems like perfect hallucinations cannot be naive realist. And like the general idea of the argument is that take the hallucinatory case that is on the right side. We know that there is brain activity going on, and these brain activities are either causing or constituting or whatever you want a sort of mental event that is not naive realist. And the brain activity is in a way sufficient for that mental event to occur. But then the idea is that when we reflect on the conscious perceptual case on the left, there is the same kind of physical activity going on there. And like plausibly, that sort of brain activity would be sufficient for producing such a mental event as well. But now we are in a position where the mental event that is in common between the two states seems sufficient to account for how things would strike the subject as being. But then it seems that mind-independent constituents are screened off from explaining the phenomenal character of the genuine perceptual case. It seems like they're not doing any work in explaining the phenomenal character. They are explanatorily redundant. Okay, so in this talk, I'm interested in a new sort of response to the argument from hallucination that has been sketched in a couple of papers, 2-3 papers in the last years. And the basic idea is that perfect hallucinations are naive realist. So they are constituted by a relation of conscious acquaintance with mind-independent aspects of the world. The general idea has been presented by Riley, Halley, and Masroor recently. And of course, like, if perfect hallucinations are naive realist, then it seems like we can block the argument from hallucination that depends on the idea that perfect hallucinations are not naive realist. So I think, like, even if the idea might sound a bit bizarre, I think it's worth examining or assessing the plausibility of monist naive realism, because I think the plausibility of naive realism itself depends on a successful response to the argument from hallucination. And so in this talk, I'm going to briefly assess a couple of proposals that have been presented in recent years. I'll try to implement on these proposals and see whether they're viable. And spoiler alert, like, I don't think they are. So very briefly, suppose like we take this as a paradigm case. Mary's brain is hooked up to a supercomputer that is stimulating her brain in such a way as to reproduce the neural state she would be in if she were to see a yellow lemon before her. We have a case of perfect hallucination. And it might immediately be suggested that since like the experience is not brought about by the normal visual pathway, this is already sufficient for ruling out acquaintance with the world. Of course, for the sake of the argument, I'm going to assume that monists have a way to show that going through the normal visual pathways is not a necessary condition for acquaintance. And this is one of the responses sketched by monists. Riley, for instance, suggests that whatever external factor is causing the perfect hallucination is the constituent of the experience. I don't think this response is quite good, but let's go on and see what I take to be the first kind of proposal. And the idea is that let's try to reconceive the perfect hallucination as a case of illusion. So in illusory cases, we have an experience of an object like a red apple, but the experience is, for instance, as of a yellow object. So the object appears in the experience to have a property it doesn't have. Ali seems to suggest a proposal along these lines. So remember, we have the supercomputer is stimulating the brain in the same way as our conscious perception of an F. But remember that naive realists are committed to this inheritance thesis, so whatever the account they provide of illusory cases, they need to respect this idea that it is the actual character of the object that is playing some determinative role in explaining the phenomenal character. So how do naive realists typically conceive of illusory cases? There are a couple of options in the literature, like the first appeals to the actual intrinsic observational properties of the objects, so like the apple's redness and its shape. And the idea is that, well, when I have an illusory experience of a red apple as yellow, it is the actual redness of the apple that is determining my phenomenal character, but the way in which I'm experiencing the red apple also partially account for the phenomenal character of the experience. So it is like the actual intrinsic observational properties that are determining the phenomenal character, but the ways in which we perceive are also playing some role. And another alternative is to appeal to these sort of situational properties following Schellenberg. Situational properties are properties that are partially grounded in intrinsic observational properties of the objects, like the apple's redness, but then also partially grounded in situational features. And situational features are perfectly mind-independent features of the scene. So it might be light conditions, perspectival factors. So even in this second case, we see how, for instance, Fish appeals to shades, but these shades or situational properties are perfectly mind-independent properties of the objects. They're not intrinsic observational properties, they are relational in a way, but they're still part of the qualitative nature of the objects, let's say. So in both these accounts, we have a clear understanding of how the inheritance thesis is respected because it's the actual character of the object that is playing some role in determining the phenomenal character. Now, if we consider the case at issue, like the supercomputer stimulating our brain in a certain way, I think it is clear that the proposal of reconceiving perfect hallucinations as illusions would fail. Because, like, suppose the supercomputer is a massive cylindrical gray machine, like there seems to be no explanation as to how the actual qualitative nature of the supercomputer is playing any role in determining the phenomenology of our experience. Like we can have an experience as of a red apple before us, and it's not clear how monists could respect the inheritance thesis in this claim. Like the actual character of the supercomputer doesn't seem to play any role whatsoever in determining the phenomenology of our experiences. And the same seems to apply to aspects or features of the supercomputer, like the motherboard or other components of the supercomputer. So I take it that this first proposal wouldn't work. But there is a more promising proposal that invokes not like concrete material objects as the actual supercomputer. For instance, Riley suggests that there would be some internal feature or aspect of the machine, a standing structure that must have been designed by the hypothetical brain scientists precisely so as to appear just like a lemon when it is experienced from a very particular viewpoint. So in this case, like we're talking about a more sort of like abstract entity, and it seems like it might be a promising way to go, and I think it's very appealing to understand this standing structure along the lines of a virtual reality environment, but because it's, like Riley suggests, that it must have been designed in a certain way. There are many analogies with virtual reality. Of course, like currently virtual reality is implemented with a headset and so on. But we can imagine that in the future, probably there would be like direct stimulation of the brain. There seems to be nothing nomologically inconsistent with exploring this possibility. And when we talk about virtual environments, then it seems like, in a way, their metaphysical nature is somehow related to data structures. Chalmers, in a paper on virtual reality, take them as being either identical or as data structure, like constituting virtual environments. But we have seen like how naive realists take the inheritance thesis and like the properties they appeal to, well, they are either intrinsic observational properties or situational properties, but in both cases, like the intrinsic properties of objects are playing some role in determining the phenomenology of the experience. But it seems like if we reflect on what a data structure is, like it's really hard to understand how it could possess like intrinsic observational properties like shapes and colors. So it seems to me that monists would require a sort of revision of the inheritance thesis, and they should appeal to something like special properties, where special properties are allegedly visible properties that are not grounded in intrinsic observational properties. And again, Chalmers, in this paper on virtual reality, actually seems to offer us a way to go, like, because he talks about the fact that in having virtual reality experiences, we would experience virtual objects and properties. Now, Chalmers has this, let's take colors, for instance. Chalmers has this dispositional account of colors, and his idea is that, well, of course, like in having a virtual reality experience, we wouldn't experience like yellowness or redness, but what we would experience is like virtual yellowness or virtual redness, because in the end, like virtual colors, for instance, are just the disposition to cause certain sort of experience, but in the conditions that are standard for virtual reality, not for standard color perception. Now, the thing is that the main idea that we could invoke this sort of dispositional properties, or in general, properties that are relational, seems to bring in some properties that in a way are essentially connected to our experiences of them. And this seems to be a way of departing from the usual standard disjunctive naive realist commitments. Because typically naive realists, when they talk about mind-independent aspects of the world shaping the character of our experiences, have in mind absolute mind-independent objects or properties. And the idea is that like these properties are constitutively independent of the experiences and more generally the psychological responses of perceiving subjects. Whilst it seems like if we conceive of special properties in the way we've sketched, we might need not mind-dependent properties, but particular mind-independent properties. That is, properties that do not, like whose identity is not constituted by a particular experience, but that in general depend on experiences, or like some sort of experiences. Now, this might seem like a problem because there is some sort of, like monists might need to revise the constituency thesis that naive realists typically set forth. But I think like they might also suggest that in the end, admitting for particular mind-independent entities has some sort of independent plausibility, because when we think about rainbows or shadows, there is a sense in which these entities are essentially connected to our experiences of them. And it might be suggested that in the end, naive realists might need an account of this sort of perceptions. And if like these objects have the same metaphysical profile as virtual properties, then there is independent plausibility for accepting these entities as possible constituents of the experience. Now, and I conclude, I want to sketch a couple of objections to this idea. Now, the first one is that I think there's a worry that has to do with circularity, because it seems that experiences could not inherit their phenomenal characters from that which they are experiences of, if the essential nature of that which they are experiences of are in turn constituted by those very experiences. Like naive realists think that the phenomenology, the phenomenal character of a perceptual experience is constituted by the actual character of the objects we are acquainted with, but in turn, it seems that the entities we are now bringing in are constituted, their identity is constituted by those very experiences. I think it might be suggested that the circularity here is not problematic. There's a huge discussion on secondary qualities, but I think there is something related to the peculiarities of a naive realist account that would make it difficult to invoke such properties. But then I think the obvious objection here is that we might grant the monist that there are some cases, cases where there is a supercomputer, where there is a data structure, and we might grant them that these cases are naive realists in a way, they might really be acquaintance with virtual properties and objects. But it seems there is a residual worry here, because we have not been given any reason to think that in the generality of cases, we wouldn't get, in the end, a perfect hallucination that is not naive realist. So, of course, there might be cases where a data structure is actually involved in explaining the experience in a way via a virtual environment or what you want. But the general idea is that what would the story be if, for instance, the neuroscientist was just stimulating the brain, so without any computer? In that case, it would be really hard to see how a data structure might be involved. Probably we could invoke the neuroscientist's intentions, but again, it seems there are many nomologically possible cases that we can envisage where it's really hard to understand how a data structure might be involved. But then in the end, if we have perfect hallucinations that are not naive realists, then the screening off problem is still there. It doesn't matter whether we have some cases where that we might initially construe as non-naive realists and it turns out that they are. We need a reason to think that perfect hallucinations that are not naive realists are at least not nomologically possible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Giorgio. Questions?
Thank you very much. I think I'm perfectly in line with you as to the negative side of your criticism, also because I never understood the inheritance thesis, both in the Campbell and in the Martin Virchow. Aside from that, I think that the main problem that this proposal, also the Raleigh proposal and the other one that you presented have, is that they so to speak, are not faithful to phenomenology, right? So they have to buy a sort of error theory for phenomenology that is not justified. In two ways. First, in the perfect hallucination case, the first person authority seems to convey the idea that the object of the hallucination, as A.D. Smith, as one suggested, is a completely ordinary object. It's not a sort of spatial entity, whether, say, a visibilium or a kind of property or whatever. Second, if these people were right, we would have to buy a sort of unjustified failure of first-person authority, because we would be committed. I mean, I don't want to say that we also have to say that the subject is justified in having a first-person authority as to the mode of her own mental states. But here, it seems that it is unjustified to ascribe the subject say a failure of first-person authority in saying that the subject does not recognize that, in point of fact, he or she is not entertaining an hallucination, but is entertaining a sort of genuine perception, maybe, of the illusory case. So I want just to know what can be your possible reactions to this point.
No, I completely agree. I think I completely agree. In a way, I think compared to other naive realist views about perfect hallucinations, probably is the one that has, even if in the end, like, it turns out to be an error theory, but like, I suppose if I compare it with like Martin's suggestion that a perfect hallucination would be just a sort of like negative epistemic sort of state, I think probably like monists or these sort of proposals make more justice to the phenomenology of the experience in a way, but still, like, I completely agree that there's possibly an unbearable sort of error theory that is associated with these views, and it's interesting because I'm trying to work on a monist reply to the argument from hallucination, and it invokes like acquaintance with like regions of space-time. But of course, like this sort of views comes with the problems you've rightly outlined. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. This was super interesting. I'm wondering, how hard do we have to commit to such a strong mind independence thesis? Because let's say, so this is going to be a very sort of parochial critique of it, but let's say that you buy into the idea that properties are dispositional and they owe their identity, and they're all sort of connected in this big networks of relations. Then surely the physical properties will have at some point in the network the disposition to cause certain sense data to an observer. Mm-hmm. And obviously the observer doesn't need to exist, right? We don't. So in a sense we preserve the idea that they are mind independent in that they can be instantiated without an experiencer either actually experiences them or even existing. But at the same time, they're not perfectly independent in that they make reference to that. And I was wondering whether a naive realist can sort of maybe sweeten the pill a bit and say, well, look, this is an irrationally strong principle, and we can sort of, if we water that down, then we can buy the sort of Chalmers things or something like that.
Yeah, no, I perfectly see the worry, because like the idea is that, I mean, typically as they are understood, dispositional properties, like dispositional colors, are in a sense mind independent, because the idea is that when it comes on like to the condition on their existence, like typically we don't want to say that they depend for their existence on the existence of perceivers, because typically we want to say that like a world where there is no conscious perceiver, in that sort of world, like objects would still be colored if we buy a dispositionalist account. I agree. At the same time, like I think I'm not entirely clear on this, but I think that the circularity problem might be an issue there, because, like, of course, like if we buy a different account of perceptual experience, like sensationalism or mind-dependent sense data, then we don't have that sort of circularity going on, because, like, even if we define dispositional properties in terms of experiences, then experiences are not determined or do not constitutively depend on those sort of properties. So I think that kind of worry would still be there.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks. It's very interesting. Can I just, as defender, or offer a kind of H.A. Humean sort of empiricist approach to naive realism, which years ago I used to discuss with a bunch of people, and it kind of goes like this. It's a bit crazy. And that's all objects, minds and objects are made up of bundles of appearances. but appearances are not per se dependent on minds. They're in 3D space, so there's a world of a totality, bundles of appearances. And when you've got veridical perception, there is an acquaintance relation with an appearance, but it's bundled with a whole bunch of other appearances, characteristic of there being a 3D object there, etc. And through other movements and changes, you can have acquaintance with these other appearances. So I can walk around the back of the chair and see another appearance, but it's bundled with that other appearance that I was first acquainted with. But when I've got hallucination, I've got exactly the same acquaintance relation with appearance, and it's and that appearance of a facing surface of an object is in space, etc. And it's not intrinsically mind dependent in its nature, though there's an acquaintance relation being set up. And that's the hallucination. It's hallucination because there are no other appearances in that bundle. It's a solitary appearance of a chair from a certain perspective, but no other bundled appearances with it. I think A.J. Ayer had that view, more or less, at some point. A crazy empiricist kind of view, but if you get used to the crazy metaphysics of it and the causation, it will preserve naive realism, right? I know.
Steve, I didn't get, you take appearances to depend on?
Appearances in themselves are not intrinsically subjective.
Okay.
But we, as bundles, ourselves, Humean bundle theory of mind, can enter into acquaintance relations with them.
Okay.
And hallucination involves an acquaintance relation with an appearance intrinsically identical to the kind of acquaintance relation to an appearance you have in a veridical perception. The only difference is in the bundling of the appearances out there in the world. In some cases, appearances appear just as solitary appearances. In other cases, they're deeply bundled when you've got what we call a material object. It's a bit Berkeleyan.
Yeah.
I mean...
But and then you would take perceptual experiences to
entering into acquaintance relations with appearances. So it's the naive realism. The immediate object of perception is itself it's kind of neutral monism. The immediate object of perception is not intrinsically subjective, but its appearance, it has looks, or it's got look built into it, or feel, or whatever.
So appearances are perfectly mind independent in a way. They're there, regardless of, by their nature, they can be sensed. There's a possibility.
Well, as sensing is entering into an acquaintance relation.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and the mind is not. It is itself kind of a bundle view of mind. Pretty crazy metaphysics, but at least on paper, I think it'll give you a naive realism that deals with. Maybe it's pretty not naive, but...
I think when we go back to Nottingham, I want to talk more about this. I don't know whether I have any strong opinion on this view.
Yeah, I do.
I'm not sure whether it would meet the standard naive realism requirement.
No,
because but I have to think more about this. I'm not sure whether it would respect the idea that perceptual experiences are essentially relations to the world. Essentially.
Well, because the world is made up of weird appearances on this view, so it is essentially acquaintance with bits of the world. The world is appearances. It's sort of Goodman-esque in some ways.
We'll talk about this. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thanks, Giorgio.
Thank you.
Okay, before leaving the stage to Alberto and Alberto's talk, I'd like to grab the occasion to thank all the participants to this conference and all the organizers, the local organizers, Donatella, Simone Gozzano, Cristina Nenca, and also the external organizers, Lorenzo Azzano, Ciro De Florio, Massimiliano Carrara, Vittorio Morato, and Giorgio Lando, myself, I thank myself. Also for the main organizer. after this last talk, there is a final farewell lunch, a sort of prize open to all the survivors of the conference. And so Alberto Voltolini is going to talk about the strange case of Dr. Moloch and Mr. Snazzo, or the Parmenides riddles once again. Alberto.
Thanks a lot, Giorgio. I won't repeat the long list of the organizers, but I would like to thank them again for having invited me to this fantastic conference. As you know, in ontology, it's very easy, on a way, either to be a sort of luxuriant realist, that is, to accept any sort of entity whatsoever, or to be a very desertic realist, that is, to just reject almost any sort of entity, but for a few cases that are possibly indispensable. So it is very hard to make, to find a sort of position that is intermediate between the two. And what is even might be stranger is the idea of supporting this sort of intermediate position, which is what I would like to do, by virtue of some empirical arguments, you know, in the realm of metaphysics and ontology. And normally I completely agree with this idea, but I have been corrupted, I must say, at least for the purpose of this paper. So, according to me, it is possible to endorse what I would like to call a syncretistic stance, and maybe for people who know me, it's not strange that I call this stance syncretistic, as regards the Parmenidean riddle of non-existence, in the sense that items that I follow in Meinung I will call loyal non-existent items, that is, items that fail to exist in a first order and non-universal sense of existence, or which is the same, that are not captured by a restricted application of the just, the only existence and first order and universal predicate that there is, can be allowed in the overall ontological domains. But what I would like to call non-items that fail to exist in a still first order but universal sense of existence, or which is the same, that are not captured by an unrestricted application of the only predicate that there will be, according to this option, can be utterly ruled out of the domain. Or what is better to say, for in point of fact, these non-items do not exist in any plausible sense of the term. The only thing that exists with respect to them is just the terms by means of which people would attempt at referring to them. And as I said, there is some empirical evidence in order to defend this claim. The Parmenides riddle, as you know, is very famous. That is, we can only accept things that there are, but we cannot accept things that they are not. And possibly Meinung is taken to be in the very nice reconstruction that Franz Berto has provided of his argument as a sort of an anti-Parmenidean character. For this is the argument that Franz reconstructs in this way. The first premise goes precisely against Parmenides. In order to merely say truly that a non-existent object does not exist, one must designate it, or in the mentalistic version of the story, one has to have a thought about it. And in order to so designate that object must already be admitted in the overall domain, and therefore, in order to merely say truly that such an object does not exist, such an object must already be admitted within that domain. And I want to say that in a sense we can buy this argument, but just in a restricted scope, so to speak, in the sense that this reply sounds convincing insofar as we intuitively accept, or we ontologically argue for their acceptance, what I call the loyal non-existent items, precisely because if they do not exist, they do not exist in a particular sense of the term existence, or they are not captured
just by a restricted application of the only existence first order predicate that there is. It's completely up to you which choice you want to do between these two options. Whereas, and in point of fact, I take it against people like Van Inwagen or Nathan Solomon, that the famous motto by Meinong, there are things of which it is true that there are no such things, is not paradoxical at all, because you can mean it in a perfect, clear sense if we appeal to the idea that I already presented, that is, when you mean it as saying that there are things that do not exist in this particular sense of non-universal first-order predicate, or, if you like, in the sense of a restricted application of the only predicate of the existence that there is. And I guess is that both, and I have defended this idea, both merely possible objects and fictional objects do not exist in this sense, but still we are committed to them. Now the problem is, can the reply, this sort of reply, be extended also to the problematic cases? That is, can we take it, Meinong's reply, as covering things that do not exist in another, still first order but universal sense of the existence predicate, or things that do not fall in the unrestricted extension of the only predicate that there is? Let me label, just for the time being, these sort of things, non-items, not in the roughly preached sense of non-ends, because I take it that non-ends are genuine entities, notwithstanding what they say about this point. So let me label them non-items. And I think that this move is very problematic, for, as we know, then one obtains the paradox against which Parmenides wanted to go, that is that non-items that do not belong to the overall domain of beings actually belong to it. And this in particular is the case of the nothing, right? The Heideggerian nothing, right? This nothing is the paradigmatic example of this paradox, for as not only Heidegger but also Graham says, in order to truly say or think that the nothing does not exist, one must designate it or think about it and then postulate that it is an object as well. So we get it that this sort of thing is both an object and it is not an object, and therefore it is a contradictory entity in itself. But why should one accept this extension? Are we forced to do this? Well, I think that we might resist this sort of extension, also because there is a famous argument by Kazimierz Twardowski that has not been so much considered in the literature, according to which we do not have to accept this particularly problematic entity. And this is how the argument for Twardowski goes, that in order for the complement of a set to be successfully conceived, one must have a subordinate concept under which both the members of that set and the member of that set's complement fall. For instance, consider Greeks, that is, individuals that fall under the concept of being Greeks, and non-Greeks, that is, individuals that fall under the opposite concepts of being non-Greeks. These are both human beings, that is, individuals that fall under the superordinate concept of being a human. But now let's pass to the problematic case, and says Twardowski, one cannot have a subordinate concept under which both the something on the one hand, that is the inhabitants of the overall ontological domain of being, and the non-something, whatever they are, fall. Why, he says? Because that concept would both be superordinate to the something and coordinated with it, that is, something again. So the problem would be not just that the entity in question would be contradictory, but a more serious problem is that you could not be able to, so to speak, establish an overall domain of beings. So it seems to me that there are independent reasons as to why it would be better to just to put aside this sort of problematic entity. And we maybe are justified in saying that, because there are cases according to which there should be no dispute at all that such cases are cases in which we just have terms but terms that we independently agree on the fact that such terms are utterly non-referring, even though they are genuine singular terms, because they belong to the class of the terms that purportedly refer to anything. And there have been provided such cases by many people. For instance, my friend Fred Kroon has given the case of Max, which is a case in which one misunderstands a sentence in which the term Max is not actually used as a name, but for some reason someone understands it as if it were a name, in misunderstanding someone saying, go to the Max, right? And this would be a case in which the term Max does not refer to anything. And more famously than this example provided by Fred, there was the example that Kripke himself gave in his lectures on reference and existence concerning the famous case of Moloch. Many people suppose that Moloch is the name for a mythological entity, but probably this is an idea, says Kripke, that is just founded on a misunderstanding, an exegetical misunderstanding of how the text of the Bible is actually construed. For in point of fact, in the Bible, the text, the term works as a mere noun, not as a name. And if you want cases that are even more convincing than the misunderstanding cases, again, Kripke in those lectures has provided another example, that is the example of Snazzo. Snazzo. The name Snazzo is a name that Kripke has just invented right now. Right? So it's not even a name that purports to refer to something, or in which it might be disputed whether it refers to a fictional entity or not, because it's just been invented by Kripke in that very moment. And it seems to me that these two cases are completely different from the cases on which people normally debate. For these other cases are cases that, if they refer to something, they would refer precisely to what I have called loyal non-existent items, such as, for instance, future entities, such as the entity that is referred to allegedly by the name Newman 1, or the case that I have invented, Elip, as the name of the possible son of Elizabeth I and Philip II of Spain. If Elip had existed, our destiny would have been completely changed, because we would have had in the middle of Europe a very big empire covering both the UK and Spain. Or other more plausible cases, such as, for instance, the case of Holmes, and so on and so forth. Well, certainly one might say that even with respect to these cases, that, as I said, there should be no debate at all that these cases as cases, the case of Moloch and the case of Snazzo, of terms that do not refer to anything whatsoever, one might say, I don't know. Because in point of fact, Marco Sant'Ambrogio, in his book on form and object, has changed the example precisely because he said, well, after that Kripke's lectures have been distributed, people have started debating about Snazzo, and maybe now there is a thing such as Snazzo, whatever it is, so we have to change the example. And so this is the example that Marco provided in the book, involving the name, again invented, Rudyard, that maybe follows exactly the same fate as Snazzo, for if we start debating about Rudyard, maybe we get in exactly the same situation. So maybe there is a sense according to which even those particular terms may refer to something. And so one might say, well, you wanted to dispense with the paradox concerning the nothing, but you ended up in the end by accepting other problematic entities. But it seems to me that the extension that it postulates can be rejected in both cases. For in these cases, one can use one of the ordinary strategies that have been provided in the literature in order to dispense with non-existent things. Well, one might add, the idea is that we simply have to reject the original premise in Meinong's argument, that is the premise that says that as soon as one uses a certain name, then that name refers to something, and that something has to be introduced in the overall domain of being. And one might adopt a Russellian strategy, the definite description strategy that can be applied, and I try to apply it to the case of the nothing, by the way, by saying that the nothing, for instance, in the negative existential, the nothing does not exist. The nothing, remember that there is the article, the. Nobody noted that Heidegger uses always the article. The article is dispensed with for some reason. No, there is the das nicht in German, right? And das is always pushed out of consideration. So, but it's very important because it signals that in point of fact the terms works as a definite description, and so one can suitably paraphrase the sentence by saying that the description means something like the item that is such that is identical with nothing. And so you get there is, in order to analyze this sentence, in, of course, one of the readings, there is no thing which is such, in the reading which negation takes a wide scope, there is no thing which is such that is identical with nothing. Or one might apply the so-called Fregean metalinguistic strategy. Recently somebody has told me that it's not Fregean at all. I don't want to get into any Frege exegesis, that Frege never said that. I don't know, okay. And this might be the case that I would prefer to apply to the case of Moloch, and to say that the negative existential in this case has to be meant in a metalinguistic way. Moloch does not exist as paraphrase that the name does not refer. Or you can even suggest a sort of phenomenological strategy. I like it very much as well. That is one in which you take a negative existential involving the name. This negative existential is false, but just within, so to speak, the scope of a phenomenological pretense that there is the object that the regular singular terms designate. Outside that scope, the sentence is false. So one might apply the normal strategies that are already in power with respect to these particularly problematic cases. But an anti-Illusorianist might immediately say, well, look, I disagree with you. For me, there are no such things as fictional entities. For me, there are no such things as future entities. For me, there are no such things as possible entities, and so on and so forth. So one might say, well, your distinction between loyal non-existent items on the one hand and what I call the non-items on the other hand is unjustified because if one is a desertic sort of being, one might say that the overall domain of beings is an extension that is restricted to items that exist either concretely or abstractly. This was the Quinian move, as you know. So maybe there is no difference between certain names such as Newman 1, Elip, Holmes, and the case of Moloch and Snath. But maybe, of course, I don't want to say that the arguments that one can provide in favor of the existence of such entities are good, but still it seems to me that in point of fact that there is no such a distinction is not justified by what ordinary people believe. For in point of fact, one might show that people draw such a difference between the problematic cases and the non-problematic cases. And in point of fact, along with some colleagues, Carola Barbero, Ivan Enrici from my university, and Filippo Domaneschi from Genoa University, we have just launched an experiment in which we have involved about 100 subjects, and to these subjects, not philosophers, by the way, we did not put philosophers in the experiment because philosophers would have immediately, why is asking me this question? Okay, but I will discuss with you the details of the experiment in the Q&A time if you want. And the data that we have found concern the truth evaluation which is ordinarily given to sentences of a certain kind that we call comparative existentials, and in particular positive comparative existential. That is, folks take the following kind of positive comparative existential as false. Emma Bovary exists just as Angela Merkel and Silvio Berlusconi. Angela Merkel and Silvio Berlusconi. Emma Bovary. But interesting enough, they do not take these comparative positive existentials similar to these ones when these positive existentials involve what we pre-theoretically might take as names for just beings like me and you. Lady Gaga exists just like Angela Merkel and Silvio Berlusconi, Jacinda Ardern, the great Prime Minister of New Zealand, just as Angela Merkel and Silvio Berlusconi, and Donald Trump exists just as Angela Merkel and Silvio Berlusconi. In these cases, people say, yes, we agree with these statements. For us, these statements are true. But what is interesting is not just that, but also that these people, if we again make a comparison in which we take the name that purportedly refers to a fictional entity such as Emma Bovary, but we make different sort of comparisons, the results are interestingly in a way similar and in another way different, that is. So when we ask people to say what is the attitude with respect of the truth value of a sentence like Emma Bovary exists just as Moloch and Snatzel, they say no, this is not true. Whereas they say that the following comparisons are true, right? That we intuitively would take as comparison that involve just fictional characters, that is, Emma Bovary exists just as Anna Karenina and Emma Woodhouse, Emma Bovary exists just as Desdemona and Othello. Emma Bovary exists just as Sherlock Holmes and Tom Sawyer. So here is our interpretation of the data. And I want to add immediately that this is not the mandatory interpretation. There are many other possible interpretations of this data that we have found, but I don't have the time, maybe the Q&A. The other possible interpretations suffer from more defects that our interpretation has. So what is our interpretation? Is that one and the same first-order universal property of existence is predicated in the relevant comparisons, but either in a restricted or in an unrestricted way, which is the same, as I said, as appealing to a first-order non-universal, to a first-order but universal, different properties of existence. So on the one hand, with respect to a restricted context, that is, with respect to a restricted domain that only contains concrete beings, that is the one that a sentence like Emma Bovary exists just as Angela Merkel and Silvio Berlusconi, this sentence is taken to be false, because in that context, existence only holds of such beings, since the domain in question is just a restricted domain of concrete beings, okay? So people say, well, no, this sentence is false because the other two guys exist, but Emma Bovary does not exist. But when we evaluate a sentence with respect to an unrestricted context, as in the case of sentence 2, the context that appeals to the overall domain of being, 2 is also taken to be false. For existence also holds, when we take existence in this broader sense, also fictional objects insofar as they figure in that overall domain, but existences cannot be applied to anything that lies outside that domain. For properly speaking, as I said, that anything is not a thing at all, since as regards non-items, the only things that really are, properly speaking, are just the genuine empty names like Moloch and Snatzel. So again, this is, we get this sentence, Emma Bovary exists just as Moloch and Snatzel. This is false, according to our interpretation, when the sentence is evaluated with respect to the overall domain of beings, and people say, well, in the overall domain of beings, Emma Bovary is there, but Moloch and Snatzel and things like that are not there. I take it that our interpretation, as interpreted with respect to a contemporary debate in philosophy of language, is a relativistic interpretation, because we take the sentence, the comparative sentences as always having the same meaning, but we simply evaluate the sentences with respect to different circumstances of evaluation, a restricted one in one case and a non-restricted one in the other case. So this interpretation holds that the relevant existent predicate always means the same thing, which is, if you like, the very same first order but universal properties of existence, but the sentences which are property predicated are evaluated with respect to different contexts, in the sense of different domains of items whose extension thereby differs, notably the restricted domain of concrete beings and the unrestricted overall domain of beings. And there is an advantage of this interpretation that can be generalized also to other cases that do not involve existence at all. So, for instance, consider this case. Consider a sentence like, yours truly dances just as Rudolf Nureyev, which of course is, can be taken as false, and another sentence like, yours truly dances just as that turtle over there. And both can be evaluated as false insofar as the extension of the predicate to dance is restricted in the first case to elegant dancers. Unfortunately, alas, I might have had different careers, but Rudolf Nureyev definitely dances better than me in the first case. But in the second case, I say, well, look, I'm a very bad dancer, but still I dance, right? Whereas the turtle is not able to dance at all, right? And this is why the second sentence, when so evaluated, turns out to be false. Another example, very interesting, that is inspired to an example originally provided by Charles Travis concerning this following case. Take this girl, Pia, that paints in green some of the russet leaves of a plant, while painting another color, say violet, some of the russet pears. If one chromatically compares such leaves with such pears, one obtains a sentence that is probably false. That is, Pia's leaves are as green as her pears, because remember, Pia has depicted, has painted the leaves in green, but has painted the pears in another color. But again, now suppose this different case. Suppose that now Pia's leaves are chromatically compared with some vegetables that grow in her garden without any depiction intervention. So they just have natural colors. Say Pia's naturally violet aubergines. One thus obtains another sentence that is likely false just as 3. Where is it? Okay. Pia's leaves are as green as her aubergines. And this time, how can we justify the fact that this sentence is false? Because one might say, well, while the first sentence tends to be evaluated as false with respect to a restricted domain that contains only artifactually painted objects, some of which the leaves are artifactually green, while some other, the pears, are artifactually violet, the latter sentence tends to be evaluated as false with respect to a restricted domain that contains both artifactually painted green objects, those that are naturally russet leaves, and naturally colored violet objects, that is, the aubergines. Now there might be a long run of objections and reply to the objections, but I don't know how much time do I have?
You have still 5-10 minutes.
5-10 minutes. So let me just consider some of the objections, and then you might stop me when I'm running out of time. So one might say, well, let's go back to the problematic cases. And one might say, well, but look, it is clear that people say that both sentences are false, because you have that in both cases the first conjunct, since there is no such thing as Emma Bovary, since we have conjunctions, in point of fact, well, it is clear that conjuncts are false in both cases just because the first conjunct is false. So why are you having any surprise here? It is the expected evaluation. But this sort of explanation does not explain why, as I said in the original example, people instead take the following sentences that I've already provided as true, because they should say that they are false as well, if the reason where they say the name Emma Bovary does not refer to anything. And whereas in this case, people tend to say that these sentences are true. And so this is This objection does not seem to work. Another possible objection, well, we can reinterpret the sentence in question as being in some sense incomplete. Because one might say, well, here the comparison has to do with the fact that people interpret to exist as meaning to exist in fiction, meaning some fiction or other. And this is why they say that the sentences in questions are true, but if are false, sorry. But if this were the case, we should expect that in this particular case, people would have to say that a sentence like this would be evaluated as true, because as you know, in War and Peace, Napoleon and Kutuzov are also characters of the story. So they should provide another evaluation, not the false evaluation, but the true evaluation, which is not the case. Another interpretation, maybe the most relevant ones, is the interpretation that says, according to a sort of Meinongian credo in modes of being, an idea that say, well, but look, people are here hearing the sentences as being in another subtle way as being incomplete, because in point of fact, people are ascribing to the items that are mobilized here different modes of degrees of existence. That is, it is false that both that Emma Bovary exists like you and me, and that she exists like Moloch and Snazzo. For on the one hand, she does not have existence in the same degree as you and me, since unlike us, she is not a concrete being. Yet on the other hand, she still has a higher degree of existence in terms of his abstractedness than Moloch and Snazzo. If this were the case, one might say that according to this interpretation, we have something like a sort of chain of being, not exactly the Platonic one, but a similar one in which concrete objects have a mode of being that is higher than that of abstract objects, and which in their terms is higher than the mode of being that things like Moloch and Snazzo possess. And this I take to be that is not a relativist interpretation, but it is a contextual interpretation. For in point of fact, according to these people, the relevant predicate existence changes its meaning in the comparison, from meaning concretely existent to meaning abstractly existence in the different comparisons. So the sentences should be read this way. Emma Bovary exists in the same concrete way as Angela Merkel and Silvio Berlusconi, false, for Emma Bovary is not a concrete entity, and Emma Bovary exists in the same abstract way as Moloch and Snazzo, false, because she exists in an abstract way, but Moloch and Snazzo do not exist in this particular way. Well, it seems to me that this second interpretation does not work. For first, it ascribes to people, it makes a sort of over-intellectualization, if you like. That is, it ascribes to ordinary people a sort of implicit metaphysics in modes of being, as if normal people went around believing that there are concrete beings, abstract beings, other sort of beasts of another kind, and well, who knows. But another interesting error that is made in this interpretation, and it is ascribed a certain mode of being, possibly the thinnest one, also to non-items. So as I said, people like you and me are concrete beings, individuals like Emma Bovary and Sherlock Holmes are abstract beings, and Moloch and Snazzo are beings just like shadows and other illusory entities were in the original chain of being by Plato. And this seems to be very, very paradoxical, because this idea that there is existence as a non-item, I don't know what it means. If I have just one more minute, and another possible objection, which is very, very relevant, that is, I said that in point of fact, when we are talking about Moloch and Snazzo and non-items in general, we do not refer to anything whatsoever, for the only things that there are just the genuinely empty names in this case. So in my interpretation, a sentence, or our interpretation, but a sentence like Emma Bovary exists just as Moloch and Snazzo has to be interpreted in this way. in a sort of partially metalinguistic way, because it is as if I would say that Emma Bovary exists while the names Moloch and Snazzo refer, and this is false precisely because Moloch and Snazzo do not refer. But how can it be the case, since here we have an anaphora, right? Implicit. We are just using the predicate to exist as applied to Emma Bovary on the one hand and as applied to Moloch and Snazzo on the other hand. So how can two be interpreted this way? That is, as implying a meaning shift here. But there is an anaphora, and since there is an anaphora, there should be no meaning shifts. But this is, fortunately enough, is not the case, because there are independent cases that show that you can have anaphora with also having meaning shifts, and in particular you can have anaphora and meaning shifts in the use and mention case, which is the case that is involved here. And this is a nice example that was originally provided by Barbara Partì. As soon as he asked, "Where is Jane?" she arrived. As you can see here, there is an anaphora. The pronoun she anaphorically refers back to the previous material, but the previous material is mentioned, is not used. So there is a meaning shift and still anaphora there. So it is not a surprise that there is also that there also be this possibility in the case of the comparison involving Emma Bovary on the one hand and Moloch and Snazzo on the other. As I said, I don't want to say that our interpretation is compulsory, right? We just have found data, and those data are very stable. And so people have to find some sort of interpretation. So it is quite possible to interpret the data in another way. We simply claim that our interpretation is more convincing than the other ones. And if this is the case, we have managed to find an argument from X-Phi showing that in point of fact there is a difference between genuinely empty names on the one hand and names that in point of fact refer to some sort of entities that are not just exactly like us, but still are loyal entities, as Meinong would have said. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alberto.
So, thanks, Alberto. That was great. I was just really wondering whether, suppose your interpretation of the data is correct, I would tend to say that what this shows is that naive, ordinary speakers think that there is a difference between certain sort of names and others. But how much can we make of this? So suppose that ordinary speakers really believe that. Why should we believe that?
Yeah, I know this objection because it's a standard objection that whenever we submit the paper is always addressed to us. I would say, well, in a sense I agree with you that is, if we take your objection as a serious one, that means that we cannot use data coming, say, from ordinary people evaluation of assessment of certain sentences as being relevant in, say, in a matter that concerns ontology. So one would say, well, yes, so in a way, it's a way of saying, well, I don't think that X-Phi is relevant, so to speak, in these sort of matters, right? And up to some time ago, I was on the same line. That is, well, this is a matter for philosophers. Don't ask people, because people might be quite confused and so on and so forth. But still, this sort of behavior, if it is interpreted this way, gives a sort of sensible reaction. That is, when you ask people to confront Emma Bovary with you and me, people tend to take a certain attitude. And they don't take the same attitude when they still compare Emma Bovary, but with items of a different sort. And this seems to me to be relevant. And the most natural interpretation is to say, well, of course, when she is compared with us, She does not exist, but still she is a literary character, if you like. It's not a nothing. Or as Wittgenstein would have said, it's neither a something nor a nothing, as he said with concern to sensations. This seems to be a natural interpretation. And by the way, just in order to prevent a possible question that might happen later, might come up later, we did not get this result as we wished if we drew similar comparison with respect to property predications. For originally we expected that people would have given an analogous sort of reaction with respect, say, asking whether Emma Bovary is a woman like Lady Gaga and Madonna, or asking these people whether Emma Bovary is a woman like, say, Emma Woodhouse and Desdemona, right? So we expected that there would have been a similar sort of difference. But in point of fact, we didn't get this result. And that's very interesting, because maybe there is an explanation as to why people do not draw this distinction as far as property predication is concerned, but they provide this distinction just when the existent predicate is concerned.
Thanks for the talk. There is an argument that I've read before that the predicate exist does not admit of domain restriction in English.
Does not admit debate?
The predicate exists in English does not allow for domain restriction. So if I say now in this context, there are no tigers, that sounds true because there are no tigers in the room. But if I say tigers don't exist, that sounds false. You can't interpret
this is Walton argument. I don't believe that this is correct. It seems to me that you can have, if you might disagree on whether there is a sense according to which the existent predicate is a first order predicate, right? But if you allow for a sense according to which the existent predicate is a first order predicate, then you get this result, and this has been independently proved with respect to other first order predicates, in which you get exactly this result, that depending on how a certain predicate. Stefano Pradelli has found a similar case with respect to the predicate of being a student. Sentences involving this predicate, depending on the class of students that becomes to be irrelevant, turn out either to be false or to be true, depending on whether the class is meant as being restricted or is meant to apply to any student whatsoever. So either there is a controversy as to whether a first order sense of the predicate of existence is plausible, and then of course we might discuss about that. But if once one accepts that there is a sense according to which existence works as a first order predicate, then it might behave as other similar predicates.
Well, as you probably suspect, I would say that the difference between these cases is that Emma Bovary is a subject matter while Moloch is not. So and you may consider this. My point is different. There are empirical evidence that people tend to deny the existence in a very full, strong way of the referent of random symbols. Mm-hmm. So take, for instance, Moloch exists just like slash Vudash or well, it's like, okay, I don't know if, but it doesn't matter. Moloch is just like a question, point, Vudash, and so on. And I suggest to use also this as a contrast class and interpret the data.
Thanks a lot, Beppe. In fact, we wanted to discuss precisely another similar experiment in which we involved terms allegedly for numbers and terms like yours. So this is an extension of the experiment.
There is a paper, I don't remember.
Great.
There is a paper in which they already did something.
Interesting. If you find the reference, please give it to me. The reasons why prudent about that is that normally people tend to say to us, well, you have to provide a justification as to the fact that such terms are names. And because some people might say, well, if we all agree on the fact that Snazzo does not refer to anything. Is this a name? Some people would say, well, maybe it's a name shape, but this is not enough in order to... And possibly your case would raise even more strongly the same kind of perplexities. But we have in mind exactly to extend the experiments precisely also to the cases that you had in mind.
Hi, that was great. I just wanted to make, to go back to das Nichts, or whatever, the nothing. So take the totality, if we can say that, of everything, the unrestricted Meinongian, whatever plurality. Can I say, oh, that might not have existed, or might not have been, and thus you might think I've got a counterfactual sort of thought about the void, or the maybe the empty world, or the das Nichts, and so forth. So it can be conceived of, and so I'm worried then we can start talking about it and saying, well, that's actually not realized. It doesn't exist, let's say. But maybe you're going to reject that and say, well, that's not a real counterfactual hypothesis in some sense. But then, given that your Meinongian garden will include lots of impossibilities, it seems like you're on weak ground to say, oh, that's impossible, as it were. So, or are you going to say the Meinongian garden is necessary? So won't it have existence as its essence or something? But isn't that weird? Or sorry, I've just got worries about those ones.
Yeah, sure. In fact, in a paper I discuss, in the paper that I quoted, sentences like sort of, how could I say, sort of Heideggerian mimics, the somethings, for instance, the everythings, like the nothings, right? And in order to see whether there are problems also with these sorts of sentences. And look, the problem is not, in my interpretation, that if the term the nothing referred to something, it would refer to something that is impossible. It's not just the impossibility that counts here. For Bambi, there are cases, for instance, Twardowski provided the example of the horse which is completely black and completely white and one and the same time. And suppose that we find a name for this impossible entity, horsey, okay? And we get a sentence like horsey does not exist. Maybe that is not so problematic. What is problematic with respect to the nothing is just that at one and the same time it has being and it fails to have being, or it is an object and it fails to be an object. So in my terminology, it both possesses the first order universal property of existence, however it is caged out, and it does not possess the property. And this is a sort of more serious contradiction than the standard contradiction of something that owns incompatible properties, because of the argument that Twardowski provided, that is that if there were such a sort of weird entity, that entity would make the possibility of, so to speak, generating an overall domain of being impossible, because in a way we would tempt to create that domain, and at the same time that domain would be immediately failed to be generated. I know that Filippo Costantini has provided an interesting reply to this problem by allowing for different sort of nothings, so to speak, nothings that do not belong to a first order overall domain of beings, but that they might belong to an hierarchically higher overall domain of beings, in order precisely to avoid this problem. But of course, even this possibility raises a different problem. But thank you.
Okay, before the next question, I would like to integrate the list of thanks and acknowledgement for the conferences, so they can go if they want. The technicians over there who created the conference, and also Elena Natale, the philosophy student who helped us.
Thank you, Umberto. So When you showed us the sentences about Nureyev and the turtle and you dancing, I was struck by the fact that it seems like just as is ambiguous. So I was a bit worried about that, because if it sometimes means in the same way as, and sometimes, you know, it's just as true. So, but of course, Emma Bovary doesn't exist in the same way as a concrete object, because she doesn't exist concretely or something like that. So I wasn't sure. Maybe I missed.
No, I agree with you. As in any case, whenever one says that there is a possible relativistic interpretation of the data, the contextualist comes up and say, well, look, no, there is a contextual alternative interpretation of the data. That is that the two sentences actually mean something different for you. In the first sentence, you are saying that yours truly dances in an elegant way as Rudolph, and in the other sentence, you are appealing to a different mode of dancing. In this case, I would say, well, modes of dancing are not so metaphysically problematic as modes of being, right? So maybe the two interpretations are at the same level, but still, it seems to me that the interpretation according to which I am a dancer doesn't matter in which way I dance, and the turtle is not a dancer at all, sounds to me more convincing. That is, in the second case, it seems to me artificial to appeal to something like a Voltolinian made mode of dancing that I possess and the turtle does not. But I agree that it is a possible interpretation.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. So, what do you think people would answer if you ask them to assess a sentence like, for example, Pinocchio exists as Geppetto exists? Because even if both are fictional characters, it seems to me that they have like different degrees of existence. I don't know, maybe it's a silly question, but...
Pinocchio and Geppetto, you say?
Yeah.
Well, that would be strange, because, in particular, because they belong exactly to the same work. So one is more famous than the other, maybe, but... in that sense.
Yeah.
Well, that's a sense of creation that is... it is hard how to cash it out. There are different theories on that, but one might say that Geppetto creates Pinocchio in the story. Or you might say Geppetto internally possesses the property of being a creator, whereas Collodi, the author of the story, externally possesses that property. Or you might appeal to Parsons' distinction between nuclear and extranuclear property. So there are a lot of technical variants in order to appeal to this, to account for this particular case. But still, in any of those accounts, if Pinocchio exists, then Geppetto also exists, or the two do not exist at all.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I wondered what you think your experimental subjects would say about a sentence such as Moloch and Snatso exist just as, now this is not a name, but we could construct one, the round square exists. Mm-hmm. So, you see what I'm saying?
We wanted to ask our subjects also comparison with those cases, but in the end we decided not to do that because that would have provided a sort of comparison between, say, non-items in my sense and impossibilia in the other sense, and maybe people with respect to this distinction are quite confused. As to me, I would tend, suppose that we named the round square Squarey, okay, and we ask people, does Moloch exist just as Squarey does? And I don't know whether we would get interesting results in this case, because probably for people the sort of difference between impossible entities and non-entities at all is not relevant. But yeah,
it just
we have
seems
contemplated the possibility.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. It's just because I feel like the data, you know, it really accommodates either this kind of ways of being or modes of existence, right? Like there being a kind of intuitive metaphysics that is operative, and you know, the line you want to push, according there's really just like a completely empty name. But in order to test that, I think, you know, if you were able to construct maybe phlogiston or something like that.
One can construe an interpretation according to which people might say that this sentence is false because they are appealing to something like an impossible way or impossible mode of being. But still, this interpretation would entail that people ascribe to non-items a certain mode of being, whatever it is, the thinnest possible one. And it is very unclear to me, unlike, say, in the original chain of being by Plato, you know, there were three kinds of beings, and it was intuitively clear in what sense ideas are the most relevant ones as far as existence is concerned, whereas pictures, shadows, reflexes, and so on are just possess a mode of being, but that mode of being is very thin. But in the case of names such as Moloch and stuff, it's very hard to conceive what sort of mode of being this would be.
Yeah, I was. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking that in order to get a hierarchy, you need an asymmetry. And so I was wondering what people think about sentences like Angela Merkel exists just as Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn do, or Huck Finn exists just as Natso and Moloch do.
Yeah, that was precisely a sort of, maybe I didn't get the point, but this was precisely a sort of comparison that we want to press people to give, that is to have sentences in which, theoretically speaking, names for fictional entities and names for concrete beings were involved in the one case, and names for fictional beings on the one end, and names for nothing whatsoever.
That's right, and you were advancing cases where there's a bad thing that said like a worse thing that's said to exist just as a better thing does. But I was wondering what happens when you reverse that. So I say Angela Merkel exists just as Emma Bovary and Huck Finn
you
do.
mean an experiment in which you revert the order of
That's right, yeah, because you need that to be acceptable to the subjects in order to get the in order to get the asymmetry that you're getting the interpretation of hierarchy.
No, this is very interesting. We didn't make this sort of trial, but this is definitely important it might raise something like a focus problem. That maybe people provide different answers depending on the order. Yeah, no. Right. Thanks a lot for the suggestion.
Sure,
we didn't get this variant of the experiment, but it should be provided. Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Alberto.